I think we did start. All right. Hello and welcome to episode 166 of the Rollo and Slappy Show.
Hang on, guys. You might have to restart. The dogs are yelling at each other.
That's all right.
That's a nice touch.
We'll bring them to the foreground. But
Yes.
Hey. All right. They're fine.
yeah, we're going to leave it in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mostly because I'm probably going to forget to cut it out. But this is episode 166 of the Rollo and Slappy Show. Today is October 14th, 2019. I'm Rollo McFlugel. And forcing himself back on is Slappy Jones 2. And we are
Jones
both.
dot.
Yes, I almost said slappyjones.com. But we are from McFlugel.com or slappyjones.com, and we are from McFlugel too. And show notes page for this episode will be McFlugel.com/166. We'll link to our guest and also probably some of the things we talk about, as well as linking you to libertymugs.com, where you can buy libertarian and Bitcoin themed mugs, T-shirts, and stickers and whatnot. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Slappy, and he's going to introduce our guest, whom you've already heard a little bit. A return guest, by the way.
Return guest. Welcome back to the show, Jake from Tasting Anarchy. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about Bitcoin again. I know Jake, maybe I don't want to speak for him, so we'll let him speak, but maybe has some criticisms of some of the stuff we've said on our show about the direction of Bitcoin or where it's going, maybe the inevitability of it, and maybe I'm incorrect in all that, but I think this will be a good discussion regardless. So Jake, why don't you, if you have a good starting point on things you wanted to talk to us about, things you think we may be wrong or misguided on, why don't you kick it off?
Sure. Well, it's not. I'll go ahead and clarify my position on Bitcoin is that I don't actually have a specific position on Bitcoin or any particular cryptocurrency. I think the technology is really exciting and really interesting. Mason and I on our show on Tasting Anarchy, once in a while we mention it, but our show's not really about that. And we both kind of describe ourselves as crypto skeptic, but it's not specifically that I'm skeptical. I think the technology is here to stay, and it's going to have a lot of implications
Sure.
that totally change our society. But I don't necessarily know that Bitcoin is going to become money specifically, or one of the other altcoins, Ethereum or whatever their coin is called, and or any of that, or Bible Pay, my personal favorite,
or Tractor Coin.
Yep, get it out of the way now.
Tractor Coin Cash RV is can't
right.
pull that out.
Yeah, so it's none of those are particular criticisms. I think that this happens a lot in anarchist circles, libertarian circles in general, is that people do tend to be kind of culty a little bit about it. Mm-hmm. And Childeberg not a cult, but there is a kind of, I think, a blindness to certain things in crypto that are being addressed on the technological side. But when you're talking about it, and in particular the Bitcoin standard, I think makes a lot of assumptions that could be true, but are not necessarily true, and it leaves, I guess, the whole altcoin, or just the coin movement in general, open to a lot of criticism that that's not really addressed exactly. So that's kind of my position. So I guess to sum up my position is that I'm not against it. I don't think that gold's going to do any better. Gold certainly has its drawbacks and has proven that in the past. There's certain starting points with Bitcoin that I think. So, this is a good place to start because it's historical.
Yeah. Well, before I don't want to cut you off, but can you establish? Yeah. No, I just want you to establish some credibility for yourself, because I don't want people to think that you're just coming in and just be blah, 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 blah. But you've read the Bitcoin standard.
Yeah.
You by your profession, you are a programmer.
Yeah, I'm a software engineer, and my specialty is in finance.
And you've been going through Programming Bitcoin by Jimmy Song.
Yes, so I'm not very far into that one, but I have been doing that. I've also been taking a lot of courses in blockchain in general. So,
and you've also been in the space for a long time. I mean, you just mentioned you.
Yeah. I mean,
I mean, long
like
relatively.
Yeah. Kind of like I've been on the periphery. Like I first heard about it, I think in 2010 from some of the listeners actually might be familiar with this guy, Mike Caldwell. He is the one who came up with like the physical Bitcoin that had the little peel off on it.
Right.
So he and I worked together. He owned a company that worked with the company I used to work for, and he and I ended up working together. And he got me interested in it. And I don't think I ever fully understood it when I was talking to him, which is kind of, I think, maybe put me in the position of being slightly more skeptical, is that he would explain it to me. To him, it was this amazing technology, and we didn't have enough time really to get into the technical side of it, but he was explaining to me like how this was. And at the time, I was definitely like a Peter Schiff kind of gold bug sort of dude, and was going like, I just don't get it. Like, and this was even before I think Peter Schiff was even talking about it. This was early, and he was telling me, and I was like, yeah, I understand. Like, I see the advantages that you're talking about, but it's not a thing. Like, it's not real. And
Right.
and he was never really able to explain to me like why it wasn't real. I also was really early on in my understanding of money from like an Austrian perspective. So to me, even physical dollars were physical. Like I knew that they could just add additional zeros and credit more banks and that sort of thing, but I was like, well, but it is money at least. So whereas now my position on fiat is that it's not really money. It's a money substitute. And is used like money, but it's not money in the strict definition of what money is. Sure. And so at the time I was interested. Now this was when Bitcoin was like $16 a coin. And I remember Mike Caldwell was like, he's like, you don't even have to set up a wallet or anything. And back then, like a lot of that stuff was kind of hard. He's like, you don't have to do any of that sort of stuff. Just give me the money and I'll buy the coin for you. I'll keep it in my wallet. And then when you want to cash out, you want to cash out. And I was like, I've got $5,000, but I'm going to put this $5,000 into gold because I think that gold's going to really skyrocket here soon. So, and sure enough, it didn't. And it's roughly where it is. And had I bought $2,000 worth of Bitcoin at $16 a coin, I would be a multimillionaire. So, well, sure. I don't know about quite maybe a couple million, but it was. I remember when it went to $52, and I was like, I totally missed the boat. And then Mike Caldwell called up, and he was like, "Dude, this is nowhere. Buy in." And I was like, "No, it's already gone up to 52. I've missed it." Then it goes up to like 250. He calls up again. He's like, "You got to get in. This is not the end." He's like, "It'll go down probably soon, but it's going to go way up." And I was like, "Nah." And then look where we are now. And actually, and this is a lower point at this point, but kind of all that aside, Mike Caldwell's position, and this has always stuck with me a lot, was that this will become money. Don't sell it.
Right. And in fairness to you, because I think we all look back and when we first heard about Bitcoin and thought about buying it but didn't. But I used to beat myself up over it. But I thought about it and it's like, well, I didn't understand it back then. So even if I did buy it, as soon as it jumped up and like tripled what it was, I probably would have sold it.
Yeah. Well, so, a lot of people did.
Yeah, and so it would have, how much different.
I would have been one of them for sure.
Yeah, how much different would a life been for me? Probably not that much. So I wouldn't beat yourself up over.
Well, that's true. And actually, my boss, he ended up buying it at 50 or something like that. My old boss, and ended up selling it at like 200. So he made a lot on it. And we actually had another friend who worked with Mike Caldwell as well. And I feel okay saying his name because he was in that documentary about Bitcoin from years ago. But the other friend, I don't know. He worked with Mike on that, and he had a lot of Bitcoin. He ended up selling a lot of his, so he does. I don't think he has much. I have some, but this kind of brings me to one of my points in my critiques in it is I had some before as well, and at some point I misplaced my wallet. It was on one of my old hard drives, and I could never find it again, and so that's gone. And even when Bitcoin is fully mined, that small amount of Bitcoin, or it was a few Satoshi or whatever, but that small amount is never going to be back in circulation, which has deflationary pressure on Bitcoin as a whole. Which is not a problem. Which is not a problem other than my critique of it is if a lot of people are losing it, and over time people will lose it. It's just it's inevitable that it'll happen. when the amount becomes smaller and smaller and there's a deflationary pressure on it, it makes it more easily centralized. And because all that it takes is for, if a government is still around by the time that this actually becomes money, and I think they said 2040 is when all of it's going to be mined.
2140.
2140. Okay.
Yeah.
So if there's a government around, even, which like I've been calling for the demise of the government for like the last 10 years and it hasn't happened for some reason, but but if there's a government still around and they have a lot of the same abilities that they have now, something that has a natural deflationary pressure on it is going to eventually be centralized. And this is, I think, one of the problems that gold has, is that one of the reasons it's so easily centralized is not just because it's physical, is that because without inflation, you are always going to have deflationary pressure on that money because it's a hard money. And so as that happens, people will, because they're able to purchase more with it, it will circulate more, and eventually they'll pay the government, or somebody will give it to the government, and that's how it'll end up getting centralized. Is that it'll take time, maybe, but really all they have to do is the same thing that they do right now, or what they did when they made holding gold illegal years and years ago, was that they say you just got to turn it in, and if you don't, we're going to come and get you.
So when you say it's getting centralized, do you mean the control of the network or just the supply of it?
They don't even need to control the network. All they have to do is hold the most of it, and then they can put an overlay on it. And this kind of brings me to another point, is that there is a transaction cap on. This is more of a technical critique, and it's not even a critique, because I understand why there's a transactional cap. And if you don't do the exchanges off chain, then which has its own problems, but then you end up hitting this cap. Now, if you raise the cap, it makes transactions more expensive, which decreases its usefulness. So if you go ahead and do it off chain with some sort of overlay that does the exchange, which is fine to do, this opens up another area where government or some sort of regulatory body can kind of intercede and become the middleman. And
so, like, you mean having like a money substitute?
Yeah, exactly. So the way that I could, and again, I want to be very, very clear on this. I don't think that this will necessarily happen. I'm saying these are things that could happen.
Sure.
And so a lot of the points that they bring up in the Bitcoin standard in particular, and some of the conversations you and I have had, just because it is decentralized right now doesn't mean that it will be. And the way it could not be is that they will eventually take it as payment for taxes. A lot of people will pay their taxes in it, especially if the dollar is losing a lot of money and if they start denominating taxes in like Bitcoin, for example, if they owe a lot in Bitcoin and their money has inflationary pressure on it and Bitcoin has deflationary pressure on it, now it's much easier for you to pay your taxes in Bitcoin. And if they hold it all, eventually they have enough. They don't even need to have all of it, but they have enough of it to where they can say, okay, because of the transaction cap and the number of people using it and all this sort of stuff, we're going to now have, virtual US dollars backed up by Bitcoin the same way as the dollars used to be backed up by gold.
Mm-hmm. So I guess let's, I got a couple counters or points or questions to make in that. I actually forget the first one, but the second one is, you mentioned that, let's say they make taxes payable in Bitcoin, and you have an inflationary fiat dollar versus the deflationary Bitcoin. So why would an individual want to pay taxes in Bitcoin as opposed to, because you normally, it's like the reason why silver quarters aren't in circulation anymore.
Yeah.
It's not because the government has the silver quarters. It's
right.
People said, like, well, these are actually retaining value better and actually probably appreciating value.
Sure.
So I'm not going to trade these. I'll settle my debts. I'll make my payments, whether it's to the government or anybody else, in the depreciating or the depreciating one.
Yeah, but silver quarters are no longer money. So that's part of the issue with Bitcoin becoming money, is that silver quarters are now assets that you hold that are going to increase in value and are not used as money anymore. So when people do need money, they turn in their junk silver for fiat. And so this is what the same thing could happen with Bitcoin, is either they'll pay their taxes in Bitcoin because you have such a deflationary pressure on Bitcoin and such an inflationary pressure on money that when you owe a lot of cash and you don't have cash, you either have to convert your Bitcoin into cash to pay those taxes or pay it directly in Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And
so sorry, if you have more.
Yeah, no, that's it.
So what does the government do then when they have things to pay? Because that's the reason why they're collecting taxes theoretically, is they have to pay people for things.
Fortunately for them, they can always pay in fiat because they'll hold a gun to your head if you don't. So, and now the place where I could see this actually succeeding really well is not in the U.S. Is that in countries that are incredibly unstable, especially if the U.S. ends up going to the point where they can't fund the wars, which we would hope, is that they can't invade countries that have switched to using crypto. And then those countries that switch to using crypto, as opposed to having some sort of centralized money, they'll advance and become wealthy fast enough that their system of commerce will kind of supersede the United States' system of commerce. So I'm specifically speaking of Africa. So I can see Africa's got so many problems, and this will get into the other things that I'm very excited about the blockchain technology. I think that blockchain solves a tremendous number of issues that exist in places like Africa. And if we have another world economic crisis that is worse, or one where the United States can't go around and like solve a lot of these problems or theoretically solve them, or say that they solve them, if they can't do that anymore because it's bad here, that will leave them to their own devices, and maybe that's where we'll see a decentralization of currency happen. And then once it's taken over and people are no longer even transactioning in fiat at all, and the government's lost enough power that the states are either just not allowing tax collection, or localities are not allowing tax collection, something along those lines, or they can't pay the IRS, something like that. I could see that, but it would involve something that I don't really wish on where I live. It would require a chaotic era. So
sure. Yeah, I want to hold back and still talk about this, what we were before we get into the other stuff.
Yeah.
So currently, as it stands, doing business with the government is very big business. It's extremely lucrative. Anyone who has a government contract gets extremely wealthy from that. So for the government to turn around, so right now, no one's forced to really sell their goods and services to the government, on a large scale with with a lot of the big business. So they would have to have a severe transition on how authoritarian they are to do that. And I think that's a huge shift in the way that the government operates that I don't know, culturally, and I know these things don't happen overnight, so it would be like anything else that happens, that it happens slowly, and so people don't even realize it's happening until it's too late. But at the same time, too, if they're in a position where they have to force businesses to accept the fiat that's almost worthless because no one wants to accept it, how good of goods and services is the government going to be getting in return that it's just going to end up destroying themselves, because no one's going to be accepting fiat outside of the government requiring them to accept it as payment.
Well, there was a time in U.S. history where they did accept gold and silver for payment, but they didn't issue gold and silver for payment. They paid in fiat. And things didn't collapse. Now, granted, we were on a gold standard at the time. And so this sort of brings me to kind of another, it's not really it's not a critique. It's just something that I think is factual, is that using Bitcoin and crypto requires an understanding of what money is, and requires an understanding of technology to a certain degree. And people who are younger, like our age and stuff, that may not be so difficult. But I also know a lot of people who are our age who are not going to get this ever.
Sure. Well, yeah,
they will still use it. They'll still use it, but they won't understand what's going on when they're using it and why it's revolutionary. And so those types of people, and I think there's far more people who are kind of in that vein of thinking in life in general, they will have no problem. Mostly what I'm saying is that it's going to be tax collection. That's how they're going to centralize it, is that they're going to start accepting it for payment for fees and taxes. And it's just like, I don't use, what is it? Is it Venmo, or is that one of the pay things?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't use that, but my cousins are always trying to pay me in Venmo when we go out to dinner or whatever, and I cover it. They'll try to send me Venmo. I'm like, I don't use this. Like, what's going on? But they all use it, and I tried to get one of them to explain it to me, and they didn't know what it was. They just knew that they could pay with it.
Right.
And I understand what is a little bit better now, because they sent me money and I had to go claim it, but or they sent me fiat and I had to go claim it. But the thing that I think is you're going to have a very large number of people who are using this or an overlay with this backing it, with Bitcoin backing it, or Ethereum or one of the other altcoins, whatever ends up being the cool one. Is that they're going to start paying in it. It's going to be normal for them to pay in it, but they're also going to still be used to receiving fiat, because that's what their paycheck is denominated in. And even though it's inflationary, I think it's going to be, see, you don't have to have something that's hyperinflating in order for it to be worthless, but because the alternate of it is Bitcoin, which is deflationary, is that you have a wide gap between the two. And when most people are still accepting fiat, and you can very easily with like the Cash App convert Bitcoin to fiat and pay, people are not going to think about it that way. They're not going to think about it in the same way as like, I'm going to save my silver coins yet. And so this is going to, and also I don't think the central bank is as stupid as a lot of times we say that they are. I think they're quite smart, and I think they know what's going on. And I would be very surprised if they were not already making plans to centralize it, at least to hold enough of it that they can control, that they can issue some sort of fiat backed in Bitcoin or in one of the altcoins. Or at least they don't have plans. They must have plans or something like that. Like, and we've seen this with various Fed chairs who have mentioned crypto. It's not like they don't know it exists. And there's some that speak about it somewhat favorably. So
right.
I don't think that this is all happening in like a cypherpunk like revolution or whatever. I think that this is not in a vacuum at all, and that the government is planning for this, and they may even be planning for this to be something where they can collapse the dollar off and then reopen an international currency with Bitcoin or some sort of slush of a collection of coins and gold as the new currency that they can then inflate and start paying stuff internationally. I mean, international currency is what they wanted originally. Before Bretton Woods agreement, is that they were talking about doing an international currency, which I actually think that he mentions that in the Bitcoin standard. So that's what they wanted to do, and then they end up coming to the Bretton Woods agreement, which was transfer all your gold to the United States, and we're going to start denominating things in dollars, and then you'll hold dollars as the reserve currency. I can see this with the IMF in conjunction with the Federal Reserve Bank is going. I don't even think they've screwed. They don't think they've screwed up, and I agree with them. For what their goal is, they haven't screwed up. They've done exactly what they wanted to. They've been paying people with funny money for many, many years and living high on the hog for a long time. And they can try to shed the bad money right now and go to a new one. And I think a lot of people won't be the wiser for it. They'll go like, look, all of these countries had a tremendous amount of debt. We had this debt crisis. We went to these negative interest rates. Those monies are bad because they made a lot of mistakes. And now we're going to open up this new money. And all of these people everybody's going to use it. We're going to be denominating everything in that. Governments are going to use that and all that sort of thing. It's going to be a new central, and because people, and it's very clear, this is starting to enter the social consciousness or whatever, that people don't really understand what crypto is, but they do know that cryptocurrencies are valuable. And so when they go like, this is, I mean, they could even call the new fiat Bitcoin if they wanted to. And it would just be backed by, I mean, just like Bitcoin Cash. It's not really Bitcoin, but they just called themselves Bitcoin Cash, right? So right. It would be basically the same thing, is that they would say, look, we're holding this slush of cryptocurrencies mixed with various assets, and now we're issuing this new fiat, and you're going to have to pay your taxes in the new fiat. You can still transact directly in the altcoins if you want to pay your taxes in that. But we're also going to, at the point of a gun, make it illegal for you to start transacting, using either old currencies or using physical metals or that kind of thing. So like it's going to be different. There's a lot of things that I can see being problems. It doesn't mean that it won't work.
Sure.
It just means that I'm not discounting the government at this point. They have a lot of weapons and they have a lot of people that believe in them.
Oh yeah, no, without a doubt. No, I understand that you're not just trying to spread FUD and whatever. These are legitimate. And anyway, it's just good to bring up potential issues. I have a few more counterpoints or
Sure.
comments or anything. First one is that I don't think people have to understand how the technology or the economics have to really work in Bitcoin to just understand that that it's appreciating against the dollar. And so I don't know that they would still just be like, oh, I can just trade this really easily between dollars and Bitcoin. So I'll just, whenever I need it, I'll just, they'll do that if they have to,
Yeah.
But I think they'll be more interested in trying to save and convert as much of their fiat into Bitcoin as they can. Just like the people that are kind of interested in it now.
Yeah. Well, and
most of them are not. There's the whole hodl meme, like, hey, because we think it's going to be worth a whole lot more in XYZ years.
Yeah.
So
I do sort of agree with that, but then this is sort of a how do you say the guy who wrote the Bitcoin standard's name? Saifedean Ammous?
Saifedean Ammous, yeah.
Yeah. So this is one of the things that he pointed out, is that we are in a high time preference society right now.
Yes.
Right. That does not encourage people saving things. And there is always a new iPhone or a new gadget or whatever that if they're accepting crypto, or if you need to pay your taxes now, or what is the example that he used? Miley Cyrus. So it's like the new Miley Cyrus album came out and they're accepting crypto. Now you may have large corporations that are saving it, but right. those are large corporations are also in bed with the government a lot of times, and they may be able to find ways around it, but somehow they were able to centralize all of the gold, and it just took them time. So one of the things that Saifedean points out in the Bitcoin standard is that Bitcoin is the new gold. It does have a lot of advantages over gold. It's probably not as easily centralized because it's not physical, but it does have a lot of commonalities with gold as well. And the things being valuable attracts not only people who want to save and use a money that holds its value, but it also attracts the predators, and the predators are the state. Mm-hmm. So I do agree with you. Yeah, that generally speaking, yeah, people do that. They save their silver quarters, and they'll try to save Bitcoin when they can. But people do spend those at hard times as well. I've cashed in silver before when I needed money real bad, and end up having less silver, which at this point, silver's been between $14 and $20 an ounce for years, so it wasn't that big of a deal. I just bought it again later on, but but with Bitcoin, like that's a very different thing at right now. But it's also because right now it's not money; it's more of a commodity, and it's not even really a commodity because it's kind of it's a different thing entirely. It's new.
Yeah, it's tough to really classify it before it's actually money yet. We haven't had a scarce digital asset like this ever.
And actually, I've talked to you about this before, and not to derail your other points and stuff on this, but that's something that is so different about Bitcoin from all other monies in history, is that Bitcoin didn't start out as something that people were already using. So nobody came in and was like, I invented gold. People using it for some things. And then over time, they were just like, hey, this is easily convertible because everybody wants it. Let's start trading it. Whereas Bitcoin is a very different thing. It does have intrinsic value because of what it is and how it works technologically speaking. But it is not a commodity. It was more I would say, if anything, it started out as a hobby or
Sure.
an experiment maybe, and then became like Pokemon cards. It was a collectible, and now it's something else. It's still trying to become money. It acts as money in a lot of ways, or it acts as a medium of exchange. But it's not money yet fully. So
Yes.
and it may not be money fully. It just depends on how things go.
No, I agree with that. I think we're kind of in the store of value stage.
Yeah.
Where it's still obviously got some volatility, but it's overall still storing value pretty well over the long term. Man, I gotta like start writing notes because there's so many things. One thing I'll say about the time preference point is that I think hard money is what cures high time preference. You can look back at the Silk Road, and that was using Bitcoin to trade drugs and whatever thing else they had. And this is a little bit anecdotal, but you hear a lot of stories of people saying, I went on the Silk Road in order to score pot or whatever else, ecstasy or something.
Yeah.
And so they had to get Bitcoin, and they started noticing that the Bitcoin was appreciating in value. And they said, well, wait, I'd rather just hold on to these Bitcoins instead of spending them on drugs. And so it actually got people to, spend less money getting high and become savers. So I think you'll have the same, maybe it won't be as dramatic as that, as Bitcoin getting people off drugs.
Well, that's a great point, actually. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah,
that is a good point.
It's incredible. I mean, the Silk Road was incredible for so many ways, and I'm sure you agree that the ridiculousness of Ross Ulbricht is how much good he brought to the world with the Silk Road and everything. But it's just another little thing that just kind of nudges it in that one direction. The other thing I want to say, and this is more about the using the money certificates on top of Bitcoin, because I think that is ultimately why gold failed. Was that it was the supply was very easily centralized, and so it was one of there are benefits to having money certificates and having the banknotes and having paper. It's easier to manage. You can do all sorts of other stuff with it. As soon as computers and the internet came out, you can do it electronically. But ultimately, that was the downfall too. And one of the reasons it was allowed to happen was because all of the banks, all these central banks that were storing the gold, there was a high cost in really doing anything with gold. Assaying it, minting it, storing it. But with Bitcoin, the cost to do all of that drop tremendously.
That's true.
It costs a little bit to do mining, but still not so much that a private individual can't do it. But as far as
it's getting to the point, and as they mine more, it's getting to the point where a private individual does have a hard time doing it.
They certainly do it now. I can't look up my computer and do some CPU mining or GPU mining. You got to have, but it's still accessible. And they're finding creative ways to mine Bitcoin. Like there's upstream. Have you ever heard of Upstream Data?
I don't think so.
He's a Canadian company that they, like the oil fields where they, where they're drilling for crude oil and they have the methane there.
Oh yeah, they have flare-offs. Yeah.
Yeah, and because it's not profitable to capture and they got to flare it for environmental reasons, but they're just literally burning energy.
Right.
So they built these modular units where they put the I don't know if they're thermal oxidizers or what in there, but they hook up Bitcoin miners to the flaring system.
This is funny because yesterday I was actually having this conversation with another group of libertarians. I was like, there's got to be some sort of economic activity you could do out at these oil fields where they're flaring that off.
Yeah, and that's
interesting. Yeah.
And you look at all the places where a lot of Bitcoin mining's happening. It's next to hydroelectric plants. We're up in Iceland where there's a lot of thermal energy that they're doing, because that's really the issue with mining now is the electricity cost. So anywhere that you can get creative or have cheap electricity is where you're going to be able to.
Let me kind of because I know Slappy's got a limited amount of time. Let me kind of go back to something though that you mentioned is that the overlay now, and this may have been solved, and I have not discovered it yet because I've actually been much more digging into the technology, not into the like what's going on with Bitcoin itself, more into just blockchain in general. But there's a transaction cap, which is I think 500,000 transactions or 500 something transactions per day.
Yeah, it's like maybe 10 per second.
Okay. Yeah. So, and that's the cap, and and they can raise the cap, but it increases transaction costs to raise the cap, which decreases the value. So, but you can also transact off chain. And this is where I see it's not a fatal flaw, but it's where there is a opportunity for a regulatory body to come in and, quote unquote, lead with the giving hand and be like, hey, we'll help you transact off chain so that we don't hit these caps, because as more people use it, you're going to have way more transactions than that. And already I think that the number of transactions in Bitcoin are skyrocketing astronomically as like South American governments and African governments have a lot of problems and people switch over to using Bitcoin. If they want to transact on chain, then this is an issue. The cap is a problem.
Yeah. Well, there's no way that we can onboard any significant amount of people using only the on-chain layer. That's absolutely a given.
Yeah. And I think I don't think that's unsolvable, but I think those are the type of exploits that government comes into.
Yes, because that was the problem with gold.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the only lesson that, like, when I was reading the Bitcoin Standard, I was like, well, this does have so many advantages over gold, but there's still these points that are sort of like this, and things like and this is actually, I don't think as big of an issue as I have read some people from like Cato and stuff who have complained about this, and I don't really see this as a big problem. But one of the issues that could be a problem in very extreme circumstances is infrastructure requirements. You do need electricity to some degree, and you need basically an ability to connect to a network. So, I mean, you can do it off chain and then connect to a network later, but those are things that are not exactly problems, but they're exploits. So they're places where there maybe is a minor gap that's not really a problem, but there is something there where a regulatory body can come in and go, hey, we're going to help solve this, and then they've got their foot in the door. And that's how the government spreads. It's cancer. It comes in, it says they're going to help, and maybe theoretically, like, the very first step that they have is, I mean, you think about it, like, what do most people say that the government's supposed to do? They're supposed to settle disputes through court. They're supposed to police violence through the police, which is violent, but and these types of things. And these are things that we admit this all the time as ANCAPs, that, yeah, these are things we want solved. And so they come in and they say, oh, yeah, we're going to solve these. But by the way, we're the only ones who can solve this. And if you try to solve it, we'll kill you.
Well, that's what they did with gold and the bank runs.
Yeah.
Right. They said, hey, we'll cut this deal with you. We'll make sure that there's no more bank runs on you. And that's one of the things where I think Bitcoin does actually solve that problem, is that it is so easy. Well, one of the issues with gold certificates, or money certificates for gold, was, since they were still pretty fungible. I mean, banks would use them interchangeably. Yeah. They, typically accepted them as long as they were a bank in good standing. But you can't easily convert. Like, it is a much different layer to do a money certificate for Bitcoin than it is for gold.
Right.
And it is so easy to validate the Bitcoin, to assay Bitcoin, that you don't need to go to a bank to do that.
Yeah,
you can do it.
That's definitely the advantage of having the peer-to-peer network and immutable ledger, is that, like, once you try to confirm something that's done off-chain that's false, you can't confirm it.
Right, and we've seen that with, like, Mt. Gox, where they didn't have enough Bitcoin to settle with everyone that had claims to it, and they went under. But that only affects that exchange or that bank.
Sure. Yeah.
Whereas with the gold money, when you start adding, releasing more certificates, banknotes than you have gold, that affects basically everyone's certificate.
Yeah. Well, but the thing is with this same example where it only affected Mt. Gox, that was the same case in the United States before like 1915. So like there were runs on individual banks, and there were crises all throughout the United States' history because some bank was being fraudulent. And this is what created the opportunity for the government to come in and seize all of that is that and Gox, a lot of people lost a lot of money.
Yes, they did.
So in those types of, and this is why, and I'm guilty of this. Like I have Bitcoin in the Cash App right now that I haven't pulled out, but this is a similar situation where you do have, these are points. They're not like I feel like I'm trying to defend the way that I'm talking about this, but they're not weak points exactly, but they're exploitive. They're exploit points. So
it's a threat surface.
Yeah, exactly. And we used to do this actually when I worked. I used to do embedded systems development, and we would do pen testing. So we would see. We would try to basically, we would have, like, one of the things that we developed when I worked in embedded systems development was this is before smartphones and all that sort of stuff. We had medical scanners. So they would so you put your wristband on at a hospital and they scan it, and that gives information or whatever for your chart, which is actually something I think blockchain technology would make much better and much more secure and solve a lot of mix-ups in the hospital. But that's one of the things that we would program or whatever. And one of the things we did was pen testing, so that people couldn't try to exploit the network for the medical technology and take medical information from people and then sell that medical information. Is we would try to go and look and see what are the places. You cannot make anything 100% secure, but people who have bad intentions, they go for low-hanging fruit. And so you go and look at the ones that are the maximum threats. So and almost always the maximum threat in that type of development is direct interception. So somebody logging into the terminal and stealing the data and putting it onto a thumb drive or whatever. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of that is negated by blockchain technology because they could maybe take some of the information that's being accessed, but the way that it's set up, if they try to either alter any of the information, or if they altered it, it's not a big deal because it just gets overridden the next time it syncs. But if they try to take the information, that's where it's nice that there's an additional layer of security where you can do different things to give people temporary access and that sort of stuff. I don't remember where I was going with this, but somehow I got it was that that's what we were looking for. We were always looking for soft spots. So it wasn't necessarily that we were looking for blatant security flaws. It was places where people would see a soft spot and then they'd figure out a way to exploit that.
Yeah, we did the same thing. We did where I work in my industry in chemical refining plants. That you do a process hazard assessment where you sit down and you just go through every opportunity that there could be an issue. What's the threat? What can you do to try to fix it or mitigate it?
Yeah. And you're never gonna fix all of it. And I do think that Bitcoin in particular has done I was reading some of the history of of its development and stuff like that. They've done a really good job addressing a lot of the problems. Mm-hmm. And it used to have a lot more problems than it does now.
Oh yeah.
And this is one of the cool things, when I did embedded systems development, it was all in UC Linux. So it was all open source. And that's one of the cool things about open source software is that you've got a lot of people working on it who think in a lot of different ways, and they bring to the table different solutions to the problem. And some of those, some of those get implemented, some of those don't. And that's one of the cool things about a lot of these coins is you've got a lot of really smart people. And, I was joking about BiblePay earlier, but BiblePay's got some geniuses working on it. And it's a weird thing. I sent you the white paper for it. It's really strange, but at the same time, it's you see some of the stuff they're doing, you see their goals, and you're just okay, this is really interesting. And one of the things that, what's that guy that you guys had on who was talking about be your own senator, or be your own congressman, or whatever?
Donnie Gabbert?
Yeah, Donnie. Donnie was talking about this a little bit, where he was like the Bernie Sanders-ites or whatever. And this actually will get into the things I'm slightly worried about with blockchain technology, where he was talking about you could do a lot of the things that you want to do as socialists or whatever. Now you just all have to agree to only trade with one particular type of crypto. socialist coin or whatever, and like 90% of every transaction or whatever goes to whatever central authority and is redistributed somehow, and which would be super bizarre, but very, very interesting. Or there would be some sort of like agreement through the auditing process or something like that, when the nodes sync, that like if anybody has more than anybody else, it just resyncs and like solves it somehow. I have no idea how they would do that, but like that idea to me was fascinating, and his idea I thought was super fascinating. And that's actually, I think, that episode that you guys did with him, because I think you guys were the first of the podcasts that I listened to have him on, or one of the early ones. You guys had him on before the Fadcast, right?
Yeah, well, of course.
Typically. Yeah, of course. Right. And I heard
Matt's,
that, and
or Pete Raymond had him on before us.
Yeah,
and Bob Murphy.
Maybe it was Bob Murphy where I heard him first, but I went back and ended up listening to the Pete Raymond one before, because no offense, Rollo and Slappy, I'm prejudiced against Northerners and their accents. So every time I hear Pete Raymond, I'm always like, maybe I'll skip this episode or whatever. Although he's grown on me a lot, just because like he's got such good information, and I've gotten over my prejudice against Northerners for this. But I went back and listened to that, and even though I've kind of been adjunct to this space for a long time and have sort of been paying attention to it for a long time, hearing him talk about it started me really digging into it and thinking about it a lot more, and much more into the technology, not specifically Bitcoin. I have a couple of points on the technology that I'm excited about, that I'm a little bit worried about, that I can go over, or we can go over my criticisms of the Bitcoin Standard, which I actually think is a very good book and highly recommend it to everybody. But there were certain things in it that I thought were kind of weird.
Sure. Before we do that, Slappy hasn't really said anything yet, and I know you.
I do have to go. No, I kind of agree with a lot of the concerns Jake has, which is kind of what we've talked about before, where I still think Bitcoin is probably the best chance we have. But I see things all the time. We all see it. Like I've talked about the story of online poker. I used to play online poker. I was in that community. I knew a lot of people who did it. Government passed a law. It was back in 2008 or 9 or 10, around there, where they made it illegal for banks to transact with these gaming companies, these online poker, and all the message board, because the bill passes and then it takes like a year to implement it or whatever. And all the talk was, we're going to do it anyway. We're going to use this service and that service, and we're going to keep this going. People were making a living on it. It's not like it was just a fun game. Like, this was people's livelihoods, was playing online poker. Yeah. And as soon as that law passed, it kind of went away. Nobody did it. It was very difficult to get your money in these sites, and it dried up fast. And now you're starting to see it come back, but of course it's all licensed and sanctioned by the government. So they're keeping track of what you're putting in and pulling out, and you have to pay taxes on it. So that's just an anecdote of something that happened in the poker community. Was really, these are guys who are living non-traditional lives. They didn't just try to, get a typical job and go through whatever. They figured out a way to make a living playing a game. And there's a lot of very smart people who play poker. You got to be pretty good with your math and your odds. I mean, these aren't dummies just gambling. And everyone was talking about continuing and, screw these guys. They're trying to take away our livelihood. And what happened? The Poker Player Alliance came around, and they're lobbying governments and lobbying state governments to get it back. And it really dried up. And that was something that, if there was a time, I thought for sure people will stand up. Like, this is going too far now. You're taking away the way we make money. And nothing happened. There was no big anger. There was no big outrage. There was no, we got to find a way. It just kind of disappeared. And there were still sites, and you could use Bitcoin to play. But that was a couple years later. And anyone who was in, there was a huge poker boom back 15 years ago or so.
Yeah. I kind of remember that, because I remember that was like they would have like the PSAs and stuff like that about online poker addiction and stuff.
Yeah, it was really big, and I guess I'm sure a lot of people did lose a lot of money playing poker. Yeah, sure. But a lot of people made a living on it, and that's the risk, and you know that. And Anyway, there was a whole big thing about it, and everyone was saying we're going to keep doing it, and nobody kept doing it. It was gone overnight as soon as the law went in. And so things like that, and then like you're saying, it's a way for the government to come in and regulate it. And there were some bad poker sites who stole money. And then, people are now demanding for the government to regulate it, and it's going to start slowly coming back, but it's never going to be the same as it was. So I wanted to kind of put that anecdotal story out, and why I don't think it's definitely inevitable that Bitcoin becomes money, but part of me I still think it will. I just don't know that it will, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, you can't really ever say it's very difficult to be 100%,
Sure,
literally 100% certain. I will say, like, to your point though, or not to your point, I don't think they had the tools to do anything back then. But if they had Bitcoin, that's the tool.
But we did, because there was ways to do it. You just had to be creative and get around it.
Well, and there was Bcash like a long time ago that it wasn't super popular, but this was like in the late 90s. There was a couple of online currencies that the problem was, one of the things that blockchain and Bitcoin in particular solved with a lot of the online currencies was the ledger. Is that it was very difficult to hold a ledger back then. There was a couple of different online currencies in the late 90s and early 2000s. I think it was Bcash. One of them was Bcash, and then there was like
eGold, Hashcash.
Yeah. There was a couple of different ones for a while, and it was the issue was that it was so difficult to maintain a ledger.
Right. And so it was centralized, and it was something that the government could knock on a door and say, "Hey, shut this down, or you're going to prison."
Right. Well, and then you have other early online currencies, like even the World of Warcraft started being used. The gold in World of Warcraft was being used as a currency for a while. Same thing though; it's centralized.
Right.
But people would transact in real life using World of Warcraft money in certain places, and it was a bizarre thing that people needed a more secure way to transact than whatever their country was offering, and I think that's where a lot of this is coming out of is online gambling. A lot of the and you look at too, like a lot of those online currencies were replaced by PayPal, and PayPal is definitely not outside the government. I mean, they're very much in bed with them, and not necessarily with the government in particular, but with the regulatory bodies and stuff. They're in compliance, and they're sanctioned and that sort of thing. So it does give a lot of weight to them. I wouldn't say I'd be scared to death, but like if PayPal started doing, Bitcoin transactions and allowing you to hold Bitcoin on PayPal, like the way the Cash App does, I don't think would be a very good thing at all.
Yeah, my point in that whole argument there is that there was ways to do it. I know people put their money through Honduran banks because the law was that U.S. banks couldn't transact. So there was nothing illegal about playing it. Like they couldn't raid your house and be like, I caught you online. Yeah. It was just banks transacting with the companies. So people would put their money through other banks in other countries and get it in. But that just stopped.
Well,
you know what I mean?
How easy was it to use a Honduran bank or something? Because there's still a lot of stuff. You're still attaching your name to it. I mean, I'm just saying that
but like I'm saying, we're not talking about like playing solitaire. We're talking about people earning a living and they weren't doing it. And it wasn't that hard. I mean, you had to do a little bit. And I guess my real point is just that it seems like people love the government and trust the government. And there's people like us who are distrustful of it. But if they came out and said, like, Bitcoin is great, Bitcoin's wonderful, but it has to go through us, I think 99% of the population would be like, oh, okay, yeah, sure.
Well, actually, it kind of gets to like some of my stuff that I'm slightly worried about when it comes to blockchain in general is that people that think like us are not the only ones involved in this space.
Right.
There are socialists involved and pro-government, pro-democracy type people, and their idea of how this technology will be applied is to me terrible. Like it's a very bad way to apply, and it's even libertarians, like minarchist type libertarians, who are like, oh yeah, this is going to be a great way to make government more efficient. I don't want the government to be more efficient.
Right.
That just solidifies their power, and they'll, Go ahead.
I was gonna say, no, that being said, all my fears and all these things that I think could happen, I hope I'm wrong. And I'm acting as if I'm going to be wrong. I continue to buy more Bitcoin.
Yeah, me too.
But these are concerns, I guess, or thoughts that I have. So
Well, yeah. I guess part of the issue is I'm not convinced that the government having control of a lot of the Bitcoin is going to ruin Bitcoin.
Well, them having control of a large amount of the gold kind of ruined gold.
Well, all the gold ended up having to go through them, though.
Yeah, because I still have a lot of gold, and I have a lot of silver, and a lot of people still hold those. Even when they told everybody they had to turn it in, there was still a very large percentage of people who kept their jewelry, kept their bars, kept all that sort of stuff. I don't even think the government has the majority of the gold.
Well, yeah, and it's also difficult to transact in gold.
Sure, absolutely.
That's the thing.
That's a huge advantage Bitcoin has.
Absolutely.
And that's the other thing. I didn't bring it up yet, but as far as the money certificates go, I mean, the Lightning Network is poised to really, really solve that problem and just make it a non-issue.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the places where the technology is really going to shine, particularly when you have groups of people who understand these problems and agree that they'll only transact on the Lightning Network. And or something like that, where they'll only use Bitcoin. And now you may have divergent societies in that case, but I think that cryptocurrency is uniting, not disuniting, or not disruptive in that regard. Like, people can live next door to each other and have very, very different lifestyles and very different ideas, and I don't think that's a problem. And I think this facilitates that a lot more than a centralized currency facilitates that.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying too is that if you have the ability to, even if the government's taking all the Bitcoin and just kind of hoarding it and just to take the supply out, it's still not going to eliminate the supply of what everybody else is doing. So that could actually be a boon for everybody if they, although they could dump it
the government could dump it
and dump the price, but then that still doesn't really solve their problem.
No, it doesn't. I mean, the only thing there is a physical aspect to all of this, which is that it requires infrastructure, and the infrastructure that people rely on now. Actually, I just covered this on Tasting Anarchy last night, was how disruptive the power outages in Northern California were to the wine industry in particular. So people, once they received word that they were going to start turning off power or whatever, they were able to account for it, but it was very disruptive. And there can be a lot of things that the government still has the ability to do currently, because we still exist physically. There's still a physical aspect to Bitcoin, and the physical aspect is not just the infrastructure, it's us. And the people being physical and corporeal and under threat of violence and that sort of stuff is an exploitative flaw to some degree. Or it's not a flaw, but it's exploited. It's something that can be exploited, that we all have family, we all have things that we care about, and ultimately, what government comes down to in all aspects is violence, and they still have that tool. One of the great things about Bitcoin is that it is international. It's non-physical, so it can be hidden. It can be transacted in anonymously. I was going to say autonomously, and then I was like, that's not the right word. But yeah, so there's a lot of advantages that kind of help us get around this, but we're not dealing with a bunch of dummies. We are dealing with a bunch of very violent thugs who act stupid a lot of the time. And there's a lot of bureaucrats that are dummies that are just, graduated in there or whatever. But they're there for a reason, I think. And not necessarily like a coordinated, sinister reason, but is that the nature of government is such that it grows to the way that it is necessarily, and that people become part of it necessarily in the same way. As like in California, you're not going to eliminate the California government anytime soon, because it's the largest employer in California. So, and a lot of places have that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a pretty reasonable, rational incentive for people to work in or with the government, is because you could get very wealthy from it. It's an easier people do things in the government because it's an easier way to gain wealth. What would be interesting to see with Bitcoin, especially if government does start to try to hold it, is that these people they're thugs. I absolutely agree, but they're motivated just like any other human being.
Sure. Yeah.
So if there's like a stack of Bitcoin sitting there, that's one of the interesting things about proof of work is that it disincentivizes bad actors and turns them into good actors because it's more profitable for them to play by the rules as opposed to trying to cheat. So what happened? I mean, does this plan by the government end up, backfiring on them because the individuals that are the same rational actors now see it more profitable to go against the government and just kind of take the money?
Well,
like there was
so.
Yeah, I mean there was just recently maybe a month ago, maybe less than that, I saw this article where this Chinese government official got caught with like bars and huge amounts of gold in his house.
Oh, I remember that.
That he stole. That's gold. That's kind of not the easiest thing to do.
Oh, Silk Road, China, the FBI guys were taking it.
Yeah, in China of all places. So, I mean, to be able to conceal you taking Bitcoin, especially, I mean, you're not going to have. I mean, let's face it. A lot of the people in government are boomers.
Yeah.
Not going to be the best at handling this stuff. So it creates it. It makes it easier for people in the government to scam the government.
Sure.
End up through their own actions trying to destroy Bitcoin, ends up destroying themselves. I mean, that's my ultimate hope is that anything that you do, like I think that anyone buying Bitcoin is good for Bitcoin. Like I think if North Korea, just to give the most extreme example, started buying Bitcoin, I think that's good for the world because it's going to more than likely eat them from the inside.
Yeah, and I hope that that's true, and it very well may be. Like I said, it's not that I don't believe, and actually, even in just the last couple of weeks, as I've been doing more of this, I'm like, okay, I'm a little bit more optimistic about this. Not specifically Bitcoin becoming money, but that this decentralized technology will bring us to a point where, even if government still exists, it's not recognizable as it is today, and it will be far less violent.
Sure.
One of the things
I mean, I'll take that.
Yeah.
I'll take that every day.
One of the things that he talks about in the Bitcoin standard, which I think is very encouraging, and this could be done now using Bitcoin only, is that this is going to encourage new innovation. I can't remember what it was that he calls it. He calls it like zero to many or something like that.
The 0 to 1 event, and then
0 to 1 event. Yeah. Yep. Is that I definitely see this technology encouraging people to do those types of things, and we actually see this happening right now just in the blockchain space. Well, Bitcoin itself, I guess these are actually one to many, but just Bitcoin being developed and us kind of moving toward Internet 3, you have this just wide open new frontier of development. And there are so many super exciting developments coming up and it's moving so fast that this is my hope for getting rid of government altogether, is that the government is still going to be going like, the speed of a Ferrari or whatever a fast car is, and we're already going to be on like Enterprise Warp 9 or something like that.
Exactly.
So like it's that everybody who has moved out of that, and actually we talked about this a little bit in the chat earlier today, is that like I think in the future we're moving to sort of like post-natural humans a little bit. Like, so there's going to be a division and people are going to be having to play catch up with people who have augmented themselves. Well, that aside, because that's kind of sci-fi, there is already going to start being a division between people who understand or are just using blockchain technology and people who are still in the analog kind of age, or like the digital age, like there's just regular digital age. And then you have the blockchain age. And so there's a lot of technologies that I kind of put here. I don't know if you can stick around, Slappy, or if you want to go. Or did you already go?
I got a couple more minutes, but okay. I'm going to listen in. I'll just jump off. You'll see me disappear off this. I won't interrupt your flow.
Right. Okay, well, let me go in real quick to the Bitcoin standard critiques I have. So, who do you guys think that this book was written for?
People like me.
Okay. So this is what I thought was very interesting about that book, is I agree with you that I think that's the intended target. But the first 5 to 6 chapters, or 5 to 7 chapters, are not really necessary to read for people who are like you and me. We've
I,
already really. You don't think so?
I was a late comer. For me, understanding the Austrian money theories was like in the last year and couple months.
Okay, well, so maybe this is just unique to me. Is that I was reading it and I was kind of bored with those first couple of chapters, and was like, okay, yeah, I've kind of read a lot of this stuff already in like What Has Government Done to Our Money and other books, Mises and that sort of stuff, and kind of going like, well, I don't know what kind of value is this. When are they going to start talking about Bitcoin? And then I thought, oh well, maybe this is actually for normies, just kind of like regular middle of the road people. And then I started, as I read more, I was like, well, no, they're not going to be interested in this either. And it doesn't tell you what Bitcoin is yet. Like there's a brief introduction in the beginning that kind of goes through what Bitcoin is, and then it's like, it may not be quite as long as 6 chapters, but it's a long process.
It's basically the first half of the book.
Yeah. It's just a long portion of the book is just history of money and like what money is, which is fine, but I'm trying to figure out who the target audience was. So there is probably a group of people who, and I've seen this with other people that you've recommended the Bitcoin Standard to, where they'll be like, oh, this is life changing and stuff like that, and it opens their eyes to a lot. I think a lot of it was very interesting, but I just couldn't figure out who the audience was. I was like, if people are kind of in my area of mindset, these first couple of chapters are a little bit difficult. But then again, like, I'll read, if I start a book, I'm just going to finish it. It doesn't matter if it's boring. So maybe that's what he was counting on.
I never thought of that about who the target. I just, because I love the whole book.
Yeah.
I learned a lot in the first half too.
Well, and, what I thought maybe I could use this book for is I could like give this to my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's exactly what I thought about it.
Yeah, and I don't
not
think
your dad, my dad.
Oh yeah, I don't know about your dad. Like my dad, I don't think would read it. Or he would probably maybe read the first chapter and just be like, okay, it's a history lesson.
Right.
And then just be like, I'm going to go back to reading sci-fi novels or whatever. And he and I read the same sci-fi novels too. So like that would be fine too. I'd talk to him, but I'd love to talk to him about this as well, because he's a gold bug. And I just am kind of curious what he thinks about this. So then there's some things in there that he makes some assumptions, and I didn't actually write down any examples of this, but there are when it comes to history in general. So my first major was history before I switched to software development, and there's a lot of things in history that when you teach history, depending on your worldview and that sort of thing, you will teach it in a way that is directed to confirm your worldview.
Sure.
Now, with the way that he teaches the history of money and a lot of these history lessons, I tend to agree with it, but it is not a safe way to teach history because it opens your argument up for critique from people who don't agree with you. And if you're not covering multiple bases or sort of presenting it in as unbiased as a way you can, then you're going to have a lot of people who are posting, and I went ahead and did a search on this earlier today just because I was kind of curious to see if I was correct on that. And Cato has a lot of critiques on his point of view of history. A lot of Keynesian institutes and that sort of stuff did book reviews on this as well. And just regular bloggers had reviews on this where they're like kind of going through the history that he talks about and are like, well, this is not true. And because a lot of what he's presenting as fact is opinion. Mm-hmm. We don't exactly know what was happening for instance, we don't know exactly what was happening in the Roman Empire. Nobody disagrees that they were inflating their currency or clipping coin. But there was so many other things going on that you can't really cover in this chapter, that when you present the cause of the decline of the Roman Empire as an increase in time preference due to inflation, you're opening yourself up to critiques that if somebody's reading the critique and not reading your book, that's a weak point in your book.
Sure. It's like sins of omission.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of stuff that was happening with the Roman Empire. One of the things was inflation. I tend to agree with him because high time preference is a huge problem, and in our circles we talk about it a lot.
Yeah, I think he was taking a lot from like
sure.
Hans Hermann Hoppe, that kind of
and
I don't want to say take it for granted, but just kind of using his assumptions on time.
Well, that sort of is what played back into my original question, is like, who was this intended for? Because for you or me to read this, I don't think that is something difficult to read and consume. But for like your your boomer, your everyday boomer who learned about George Washington never telling a lie and that kind of thing, those people would not be as receptive to a lot of this information.
Sure.
In the way it's presented.
Just on that, I was listening to an episode of Dave Smith over the weekend where he had a guy named Nick Fuentes on. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yeah, great episode actually. I thought it was a very interesting episode.
I thought it was too, but that was one of the critiques of that book he brought up. He's like, I just kind of thought it was a joke. Everything's due to high time preference, like.
Well, I think he exaggerated it, but yeah.
Well, he was exaggerating, but he did kind of say like I couldn't take the book serious, so he was not understanding that point he was trying to make. So whether you could argue over that point, which I thought Dave kind of did a good job asking him more questions about that, but he's a pretty smart guy reading this and just didn't see it, didn't connect with it.
Sure. Yeah, and things I don't know how much. Hang on, guys. Hey. All right, he may start barking again, but he's trying to get the other dog to play with him. But he hasn't. Well, yeah, I guess he's just getting bark. But
that's all right.
Actually, and I just realized that my recording of this crashed. Are you recording this on your side?
Yeah, I'm recording everything.
Okay,
so
good. Okay, because I was recording all of us as a backup, and I just realized like 20 minutes ago it shut down.
Nice.
But anyway, so to that kind of that is. And I actually maybe I missed that part of the episode. I usually listen while I'm at work, so
sure.
That's kind of the point I was making is that like it's difficult. History is a great tool when your audience is already predisposed to like what you're saying. But if it like in the length of the Bitcoin standard, which is very short, if you're not already dealing with people who are Austrian and kind of agree with your worldview already, it makes the book not believable.
Okay.
The other thing was there are some conclusions that he goes to as well in his history of money that I think are true, but not necessarily true. So like one of the things that he talks a lot about is those stones on the island with holes in them.
Yep.
And then people, somebody else shows up and they're able to just like mass produce those and that sort of stuff. Is that there's a couple of conclusions in there where I agree with him why that money collapsed. But then he kind of he skips a couple of steps and starts talking about other instances where that same thing happened, and why gold ended up winning out overall. But if you go and look at that particular instance, gold never won out over them. They just had an inflationary thing and became slaves basically, and they weren't transacting in gold. So there are certain circumstances where he says like, well, because this happened and this happened, and this happened, therefore gold. And then he tries to apply that to this happened, this will happen, this will happen, this will happen, and therefore Bitcoin, where that doesn't necessarily follow. It could be the case, and overall on a global scale, gold did end up winning out, at least in North America and Western Europe. Well, in most of Europe, actually, the Tsar and stuff had their money was also backed by gold. But like there were other parts of the world where they were not transacting in those currencies still, and it took a modern age and the enforcement of fiat to globalize currency. So there are certain things that like they're not necessarily. I don't necessarily think he's wrong, but this is kind of the same flaw as the other flaw, where it's like, yeah, you're opening yourself to critiques that are not going to they're not going to be easily defended because we're already in our own minds and have decided on this topic. So like when you and I, like I've got relatives that are pretty hardcore socialists, and when I go and talk to them, the majority of our conversation over several days is usually coming to terms, like coming to like agreement to how we're going to talk.
Right.
And hang on, Victoria, could you keep them stop? Can you stop them? Sorry about that.
No problem.
So then that kind of that's one other area is like I'm thinking of one cousin in particular. He and I have a lot of conversations about this stuff because he's like a hardcore Bernie socialist and not stupid about it. Mm-hmm. He's very wrong, but he's not a dummy. He's a very smart person, and he and I have conversations, and the majority of our conversations is coming down to terms. So like we'll get to a point where we're actually talking about the same thing, but the conclusion that we draw from what we're talking about, like, like we'll get down to like, global warming or whatever, and we're both talking about the same thing, but his therefore and my therefore are completely different therefores.
Right.
His therefore is therefore we need a centralized federal government to come in and do this sort of thing, and my therefore is this is why we need to decentralize and get rid of the government. So there's these large steps that I think Sabaudin makes in the Bitcoin standard that for normie readers is going to be a step that is too big for them to make, and they're already going to be stepping in the opposite direction. So that's why I guess my first thing was who's the book for, because I think that this is a really great book for ANCAP leaning libertarians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
not necessarily for other people.
Yeah, for me it was I had read God or Democracy, the God That Failed by Hoppe about a year before that, so it's still relatively fresh in my mind. It was taking a lot of – it actually made – I know this is going off on a tangent a little bit, but I read that book and agreed with, the majority of it. There were some spots like, I'm really not sure of it, but reading the Bitcoin Standard actually made that book make so much more sense.
Okay.
I do think now that I'm thinking about it a little bit, I do think, or at least what I would say the intended audience for the book is basically what you're saying is the kind of ANCAP leaning libertarians, maybe a little bit into Bitcoin, maybe not, but yeah, I think it's for people that don't understand money very well. And I do think that the vast majority of libertarians do not understand money economics very well.
That's probably true.
It's a little bit different, or sometimes very different than just like kind of applying what you would normally do with economics. I mean, how many people out there are saying like, well, we can just have 8 billion different monies out there and it's all going to work great.
Yeah.
So they just
it won't work. It won't. It won't work. But
right. But I think. So I think it's clearing that up for people, and I was one of those people. I remember just over a year ago. I remember when it was first.
We just did an episode on.
Yeah. The last 2 episodes ago was where I was, just wrote an article a couple of years ago where it was just awful. My understanding.
Oh, yeah. We do this all the time where we go back and look at something. Well, Mason and I have been friends for so long, and we met through libertarianism. It's very interesting for us to kind of go back and like see correspondence between each other, or like think about like things we talked about over beers and stuff, and be like, I would hate myself now. I'd be like, what is this statist jerk doing at these libertarian meetings? But like that, I think that gives a good perspective though. And one of the reasons why things like Childerberg are near and dear to my heart is that like I like the expanding movement. And I do know that there's a lot of people that if they get onto the path that I got onto will end up where I'm at. And that's what I kind of want.
Sure.
Let me cover my last 2 criticisms on this real quick. So when he talks about Keynes, I agree with him. Again,
he took some shots, didn't he?
He took some shots that I don't think are necessary to the book and are also a big turnoff for. And the reason that this actually came up is these are things that I didn't even pick up on until I went and looked and read alternate critiques of the Bitcoin standard. The fact that Keynes is kind of a pedophile isn't relevant to this argument at all. And because that's in the book, if somebody already has, let's take your kind of run-of-the-mill, whatever your opinion of him, that's kind of irrelevant to the conversation, but you're sort of run-of-the-mill, maybe slightly more extreme libertarian like Jason Stapleton. Mm-hmm. He has a lot of positive outlooks on Keynes. He doesn't agree with him on a lot of stuff either, but he does think he's a brilliant person, has a lot of positive things. If he went in and read this, and I don't know where he's at now, I haven't listened to him in years, but if somebody like Stapleton, back when I listened to him, went in and would read this, he'd be like, oh, this is an ad hominem attack, basically. Like they're attacking the person who came up with Keynesian economics, not necessarily the economics. That would shut them off to the argument. And this happens. This is what, if you've ever read the book, it's called Art of Libertarian Persuasion by I'll have to look up who it's by. I can't remember who it's by. He talks about one thing that's very common with libertarians is he calls it the libertarian macho flash. And it's where you basically show everybody that you're more libertarian than them. And we joke about this online all the time, where like if you have 3 libertarians in a room, the only thing they'll all agree on is that they're the only libertarian, kind of thing.
Right.
And this is kind of one of those instances where it's like, yeah, there's not really. Keynes is kind of a shithead and not a great guy, and he destroyed many nations with his economic ideas. But there's 2 things about Keynes that I think that Sabatini has wrong. I think there's actually several things that he says about Keynes that I think are historically inaccurate. They're not factual. I wrote notes on them, and I don't want to bring them up because I need to check that myself, because he said them and I was like, I think those dates are wrong, but I could be totally wrong about that as well. The other thing is these sort of like the personal attacks on him, which again, I don't have a problem with that. And if the book is intended for people like us, no problem. That doesn't turn me off of the book. But if the intention of the audience is people who are more on the status side of things, this is not going to be helpful.
I remember reading those shots a little bit, and I kind of took that, and maybe this was just me confirming a bias. Could have been, but it was more a demonstration of his high time preference. I know it's going to sound like
he definitely did.
There's the joke. It's high time preference, but I mean, I thought that's kind of what that was. It's like it's pervasive. Like this high time preference mindset is just pervasive through everything a person does, including deciding to go and
tour the Mediterranean and boink a bunch of little girls and boys.
Yes.
I mean that's not how I read it, but
okay.
that makes a lot more sense, because it being like a pot shot joke, it makes a lot more sense than it being just a attack on the person to delegitimize the argument. Sure. So like you may if you have a perfectly sound argument but you're like some sort of weird freak, then those are separate things. Your argument's not wrong because you're a freak. So that's what I drew from it. But I also had a very critical reading of this book for some reason. Like I found myself agreeing with it a lot more than I thought I would. But there were certain things in it, and that's why I think I was a good person to read the book, is because there were things that I was able to read it and go like, well, I don't think that's true exactly. And then the last item is he's very, very negative on the technology, I thought, the alternate applications of blockchain. And that's the thing that I'm most excited about, is the technology itself, which we can get into next. We're already running way over, so I can get into it.
No, it's good. Quickly. Keep going. I'm going to jump off. Okay. But yeah, keep going, because I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, I got all night. So.
Okay, cool. So so he's very negative on the other aspects of the technology, I thought, which was a little discouraging, because I see what Bitcoin did for the market is opening up the technology. So sort of a proof of concept of blockchain. And there are a lot of things that I think are really exciting coming out of blockchain technology. So like dApps, distributed applications, public ledgers, chain of custody, smart contracts, I think are going to be hugely important very soon.
I think this is where I can finally not speak for him, but speak to those because I agree with him on being kind of negative on. Well, I'll say this: negative on and this is maybe where we're speaking. You mentioned about agreeing on terms. We might have to take a step back and agree on terms. Like just a blockchain by itself. Like any of those things you just mentioned, like the dApps, the smart contracts.
Yeah.
Like if you attach them to Bitcoin, then absolutely. I think
I'm totally fine with being attached to Bitcoin. I don't care about the money portion of it. What I care about is the technology portion of it.
Yes, and I think without the money portion of it, then it's not useful, because it's like, I see these commercials where they're talking about like, oh, we use blockchain technology to make sure that the tea is and it's like, well, how? Because if it's all the same entity running the nodes, then what's the difference between using a database, it's a centralized database.
Yeah. So
you're all the same players, all the same incentives, doing typically running in somewhat of alignment. If there is, because you would hope that if this farm or whatever this business is trying to make sure that the right tea from the farm is getting into the right tea bags, that if they're having adversarial problems within their business, then they've got bigger problems.
Okay.
Blockchain proof of work
this actually
solves the adversarial.
This kind of explains a lot of like when you and I were talking about this for
that's why
my ideas. So let me take a step back real quick, and I'll say, and just for the listeners, and for just from where I'm coming from is a blockchain. So it's exactly what it sounds like. Is that it's a series of linked blocks, and they have certain characteristics that make it blockchain. So the first characteristic is that it uses hash cryptography. So no matter what you do to it, you're going to have a almost unique hash on the block. So as soon as you put it out there and it's ready to be attached to the chain, this is a hash that's going to be unique. And it's not exactly unique, but it's like fingerprints. It's like 1 in 30 million or something like, or 1 in 60 million, I think is that they may have something that's the same. And if they do,
there's metrics like to explain how unlikely it is, and it's like astronomical.
Yeah, it's astronomically unlikely that it's gonna have the same hash, but it's possible. But yeah, so this is part of it, is that it has a hash, and then when you attach it to the chain, this points to the previous block, so you know exactly where it is. And then when another block is added on the other side, that block points to your block. Let's say that, well, it's called the middle block your block, and the previous block my block, and the future block Rolo's or Slappy's block. So Slappy's block points to my block points to your block, and it all points to the hash. And so this is what when we add in another layer of it is what makes it so that you can have a chain here. So you've got a chain that is not it's the immutable ledger that's confirmed by a distributed network. So this is the ledger, is that they're all attached in a series. The hash cryptography is the key that points to the previous one, so you know where it goes. And the distributed network is how you make sure that it's confirmed and it's very difficult to adjust it, or it makes it uneconomical to adjust it. So if you have, whatever number of nodes going through and confirming the blockchain every single time, is that, I mean, this is all stuff that I'm just kind of explaining it to kind of get my ideas going here, is that basically these all confirm it. So even if I was able to hack you and change yours, when you synced, it would change yours back to the correct one.
Right.
Because you wouldn't have enough people outside of your area confirming that you're the correct one. They would say, no, yours is wrong. It was somehow, messed up through hack or other reasons. And so we're going to go ahead and refresh this, and also add in, whatever the new stuff is, so that you don't have. And then you have the mining, which is in Bitcoin, is the proof of work, which seems to be the most secure way to do it. There's other ways of mining that I think they're still working on, and I
mean like different algorithm, like Mimblewimble.
Well, no, like there's proof of work, and then there's like proof of
stake.
Proof of stake, that's it.
Yeah.
Proof of stake, which is weird. I don't fully understand that one. I think that's the one that Ethereum is working on.
Yeah, they are. I don't think it's. I mean,
well, it's interesting,
as everyone knows, I'm bullish on Bitcoin,
I know.
bearish on anything else. But
yeah, well, there's other things going on with Ethereum. It's the only reason I bring it up, because there's things happening in Ethereum that I think are very interesting. I am not at all deep enough into any of this to really give a great defense or like offense or whatever of any of them. Bitcoin to me seems to be the correct one because of who's using it. Like it's being used more. It's not necessarily stable exactly, but it seems more stable than the other ones. So, and the other ones seem to more be like derivatives of Bitcoin.
Yes.
So they're not. It's like everything else is like silver to gold. It's like, yeah, they could be useful in a lot of circumstances, but they're not the real McCoy, I guess.
Yeah, a lot of the features that they talk about are actually kind of serious flaws.
Sure.
Just to give an example with Ethereum, one of the issues is that it's almost impossible to run a full node.
Right.
So they've already they've changed the supply schedule, I think at least once. They're not even going to they don't even have a plan to use the current Ethereum network. They're working on Ethereum 2.0 if that ever comes to fruition.
Well, and that's one of the things that I'm actually more interested in Ethereum is some of the side technology that I think is interesting on it. And the money aspect of it is where I think you and I are kind of like have a division, is that you're very interested in the money. I'm not particularly interested in the money because I think whatever will be money. And and that's fine. I don't really care what it is. I mean, at this point, I know that the majority of my personal wealth is going to be eroded in some way. I have Bitcoin. I have a lot of gold as well. So I don't actually have any altcoins, surprisingly, except for maybe I have Bible Pay because they gave it to me. But yeah. So anyway, so the mining aspect of it is another thing that's part of the blockchain, and then consensus protocol. So that's kind of what I'm talking about when it comes to blockchain, is that you can have private chains, and in certain applications, I think a private chain makes sense. One place where a private chain makes a lot of sense to me is healthcare. There's a lot of things that I think would be very important to have on blockchain when it comes to healthcare. Mostly just your information, so they don't do the wrong thing to you. And that could be held privately, and you could run nodes, the Internet of Everything or the Internet of Things, where like refrigerators have internet and all that sort of stuff. Well, in a hospital, and the only reason I know this is because I used to develop embedded systems, is that everything in a hospital pretty much talks to each other. Mm-hmm. And they're all running little computers and stuff like that. If you have an efficient chain, you don't really need to worry that much about a distributed network, because you can just put it in the software that's running on all the medical equipment. And so all of that is connected. It can do these side calculations and things like that, which is confirming transactions on chain. And it doesn't have to be in one hospital. It can be multiple brands coming. Like, how like credit card companies work, is that, a lot of places will accept multiple credit card companies. Well, if your medical information is on Texas healthcare chain and mine is on Pennsylvania health, or vice versa, mine's on Pennsylvania healthcare chain or whatever, there is a way to make that exchange, or eventually the better chain will win out and the blocks from mine will be added on yours. It'll be a manual process and there could be mistakes, but then you can also get the medical equipment to confirm that. So I don't think that incentivizing it is that big of a deal when it comes to certain applications, because you can build it into the technology that is already being used in that field. In particular, I'm thinking in the medical industry, because so much of their equipment is already on network and already doing calculations. It's not a big deal to also have it run a node.
Sure.
So
yeah, and maybe to make it more agreeable with what I said, like, I don't really care if it's on Bitcoin. Yeah. Like if it's on assuming that we have a cryptocurrency, I'm saying it's gonna be, but it on whatever money it is, we could attach that, just because you want that mining incentive. And even with Bitcoin, there are like the federated side chains. That you could do that, where it would be like, you could run your business could just put the side chain. And, you would have to be the trusted party there, that you're not going to do something weird. But again, if that's how you want to organize your data on. Well,
I think it's really good. I think it's a very good way to organize your data, is that when the data is distributed and confirmed and in multiple locations, you have a lot less data loss. And the way that the blockchain technology works is helpful in making sure that the correct thing is done to the correct person. Mm-hmm. So because you have a key, your doctor has a key, and when you need something done, you both add your key, and that confirms that, yes, this is the correct person.
Oh, sure. Well, it's like sending an email.
Yeah, exactly. It's the handshake. It's like handshakes. Sure. It goes, yes, we've got the same person there. And in the case of blockchain, which is great, is that there's not something in between that. Now, I do tend to talk about this as if it was all existing online. There is a physical aspect to it. So in all of these cases, there's going to be a physical intermediary that could happen. But I see this actually, the medical application of this to me seems incredibly valuable, because you can add another application to it, which I think is going to be super valuable, and that's smart contracts, which is Rolo needs to go in for toe surgery or whatever, and So Rolo signs a contract that he's going to pay X number of Bitcoin to this doctor once the toe surgery is completed and healed. And the doctor doesn't get paid unless he does his job correctly. Mm-hmm. Because Rolo has to confirm that contract after the surgery is done. And if he dies and his key is gone in the surgery, the doctor doesn't get paid. And so this increases the incentive for doctors to not screw up.
Yeah,
and
that's
also
pretty
reduces
good.
Yeah, and it also reduces malpractice insurance, which reduces medical costs, which makes this whole thing a lot more accessible and a lot easier.
So I have a couple. Hopefully this clears it between us or whatever. But if you're suggesting a private blockchain within a hospital or something, and I think part of the issue when people bring up these blockchain ideas and and all these, that they're attaching a token to it. And so they have like this weird thing where the token is kind of like a quasi money currency, and it's like, well, it's if you're trading it among people, then, and it's kind of centralized, not many people use it, it's easy exploitable. But if you're not, if you're doing it more like an email type thing where you're internally just assigning ownership of whatever you're trying to do, not needing a token to do whatever you're trying to do, then I don't think any Bitcoiner, no matter how hardcore, would really have an issue.
The way I see
what you mentioned with the smart contracts is that's a perfect opportunity to do kind of the side chain where you want to have whatever the money is be the thing that is denominated in the smart contract, and that's why you would want it attached, that side chain attached to the main blockchain.
Right. Yeah. And so that's kind of how I envision almost all of this technology working this way, is that you have a stake that is a certain amount of Bitcoin or whatever currency. I don't really care. Whatever currency wins out, you have that that's the stake. So I want you to do something for me. And so I put up a certain amount of money that you will receive once the contract is fulfilled automatically. Mm-hmm. And if you fail to finish that and satisfy me, the customer, if I'm not there to confirm it and pay you, if for some reason I die, like in the medical situation, there is maybe a time limit where the money will be then transferred to one of my heirs automatically, so that it won't just lock up these Bitcoins for eternity.
Sure.
But this is something that they'll have to discover on how to do these smart contracts, but it'll be able to automate transaction without a middleman. And I think that is very, very helpful. And the way that you will get people to agree to confirm it, even if it's public and decentralized and not private at all, the way that you'll be able to get people to confirm it is that there will be, one way that you can do it is you could do a reward system based off of a percentage of the fees on the contract will be paid out randomly or through some sort of algorithm based on people confirming it. And that will be built into the contract so that when, let's say that I'm going to pay you to do something that is, 4 Satoshi or whatever. And so I have to put 5 Satoshi into the pot. When the contract is fulfilled, you'll get 4, and 1 will be divvied up by whatever algorithm there is to the people who confirmed the contract at random or whatever. And this will give people an incentive to do it. The other way that I see this going is the Internet of Things. Is that if Linux or Windows or whatever builds in to their software just carrying these nodes, which I think is very easy, that if you put it into Android or put it into iOS or something like that, people would just carry it. They wouldn't even know that their phone is confirming it. And I don't think that's a problem. Or they could opt out of it. It would just be an automatic opt-in. And this would be hugely beneficial to a lot of these corporations to do this, or put out like, what's that app that they're always advertising on Facebook and Twitter and all that? It's like King's Quest or whatever. It's like, just build it into King's Quest. People will download it to play King's Quest. It's doing this other stuff in the background.
It's like it's like a Trojan horse.
Yeah, exactly. It is, but like,
but a good one.
Yeah, a good one. People agree to do this stuff all the time. The thing is, like, my refrigerator runs stuff. But my refrigerator is actually not connected to the internet. But there are refrigerators that are connected to the internet. They can run these things, and they're mostly running off of Linux. So if you can get certain people to agree to put it into the software that they put onto their appliances or not even the people who are buying the appliance, the manufacturer. Just, okay, yeah, you're going to give me a Bitcoin to put this into this version of the software. Sure.
Yeah, well, I think that may be what kind of solves some of any sort of mining centralization issues in the future, is if ASIC miners become so commoditized that they get really cheap to produce, that you're just going to have them built into like everything.
Yeah.
So you're just going to be like the mining decentralization is going to be like insane.
Yeah, I think so too. And you already see this with a lot of the technology that's just regular appliances hooked up to the internet for random reasons. There's already a lot of stuff in those that you probably don't know about and maybe don't want there. But in this case, it's something that's relatively benign and will just run, and it'll also benefit. You could figure out a way to make it benefit the product that you're selling as well. So if it's a refrigerator, you could figure out some way to say, like, look, this is going to be on all of our refrigerators. They're all going to be hooked up to the internet unless you opt out of it. And because, supply chain confirmation is really popular right now, is that part of the contract of building refrigerators is going to be that for X number of refrigerators that you build that have customers that opt into confirming this stuff, you'll get X percentage of the of this pot that we started.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all you need. And then people will opt out of it eventually or whatever, or the new, or the refrigerator will break and they'll get a new one. And things will change, but like that's one way you can do it. I'm not of a lot of people are like, well, I don't want stuff running on my, appliances and stuff like that because I don't know about it and all that sort of stuff. Like as a software developer, there's stuff that I put into software all the time where I'm like, yeah, this is going to be beneficial to the end user. They pay me to do this, but I don't want to explain it to them because they're not going to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, and there's nothing wrong with providing services at a fee.
Yeah.
I mean, that's right. What's going to have to, especially with like the Lightning Network, to add incoming liquidity, you're probably going to have to pay someone to open a channel with you.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that.
I agree. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think it's going to be as these things become cheaper and easier to operate, as the technology matures, you're going to find out that these things are built into your phone software and things like that, and it's just not. Or you're going to have like some. I downloaded the Cash App today because I wanted to access that money, mm-hmm. and they could put that into the Cash App. I would have had no idea if it was there, and without reading the user agreement. So and who reads that? Right. So you've got that. So those are some things that I'm kind of excited about in it. I like the transparency that is provided by the public ledger. I think mm-hmm. there's a lot of I can't remember what it was. I was reading one of these blockchain books where they talked a little bit about Enron, and like one of the things with Enron was that they were keeping multiple sets of books, and that makes people distrust large companies. That Enron didn't necessarily provide a great service because they were doing things like selling electricity from California while California was in a brownout situation, things like that. But these are corporations that are in bed with the government. But in a lot of cases, in order to build trust with your consumers or the people that you're trying to do business with, it's a good idea to have your books up and in full view of everybody. You wouldn't always want that, and that's why private chains would be good as well. But private chains are also less corruptible because even though they're private within your company, they are confirmed in multiple locations, whereas when you're running, QuickBooks or whatever to keep your books, that's one location that could be adjusted by your accountant.
Sure.
And so this is inviting corruption. It's also switching over to a decentralized ledger is going to, whether it's public or private, if it's decentralized, it encourages, or it doesn't encourage, it reduces the risk of fraud. And I think that that's good for all companies that are not fraudulent, is just to have their ledger decentralized so that people can see what happened, and it's easy to trace it back. And that way, I mean, QuickBooks actually does a decent job making sure that all transactions are logged so that people can go look through the log. But in the case of things that you can set up to work on chain, is you can set up different alerts for altering transactions from previous times and that sort of stuff, and you can even have it where it doesn't go onto the chain until like the boss confirms it or something like that. So I think that's very exciting that this is going to, and it's also going to reduce a lot of overhead. I think you don't have to have as many auditors if the ledger is public because it's publicly audited continuously. So one of the things that happened when I used to work in payroll is that every couple of years the government would increase the level of auditing that you had to have done, and every year it would become more expensive, of course.
Oh yeah.
And so you had a lot of financial companies that had to go through these different types of auditing, and the auditing was ridiculous. Like I had to sit with the auditors, and they didn't know what I was doing. I'm a software developer, and they were like, "Well, what are you doing here?" And it's like, "Well, I'll explain it to you." And they're like, got it." And then they write it down. It's like, you don't know what I was talking about. And you have no idea if I'm committing fraud here. I just showed you the code, but you can't read it. And that's but when the books and stuff like that are public, people can continuously look and see. Like in the case of a payroll, is that you can have it partially private, or you could have it encrypted. So when a payroll is complete, they can see that the block was done. They can see certain things about the block. But if you don't have the key to view the encryption, then you won't be able to see the details, like people's personal information. So the company that you're doing payroll for, they could hold the key, and then they could put that in and they go, "Oh yeah, look, my payroll looks good." But in the meantime, it's on the distributed network. Every client that is getting payroll processed through your payroll company is confirming it. They may not know a lot of the information that's happening on it, but because it's encrypted, but they are all making backups of it, all saving it, and this helps reduce fraud a lot. It also reduces the cost of auditing. And so I think that's going to be huge amounts of savings. But there's a flip side to this, and this will get into my worries a little bit. The flip side of this is it will, if applied correctly or applied efficiently and for statists, it's going to make government much more efficient. If they decide to start switching departments over to blockchains so that the internal auditings don't have to be done as frequently, or that the auditings are easier, and also when you make payments to the government, it's on chain so they're not losing stuff. And this also kind of is an area where I think that as part of smart contracts, kind of, but deeding I think is going to be on chain eventually. So which is part of chain of custody, is that this is going to be, I would hope, be taken out of the holdings of some sort of central government authority and put out into a public ledger so everybody can see who owns what. They may not know the personal information, but they can see that this is owned by this person or whatever, and then you can provide the key. But if the government kind of beats everybody to it and does it and has control over a privatized chain where this stuff is, and people just get used to operating that way, that may be a problem. So that's something I'm a little bit worried about. And I'm always worried about the government becoming more efficient. You know, a lot of conservatives and the kind of Friedman type people are like, they're always kind of like, well, the problem with government is they're not very efficient. And it's not that they're sinister. They are sinister. Like I don't think that the people necessarily who work for government have like sinister motivation, but the nature of government is sinister.
Well, it's glass half full here.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not so, because it's like every once in a while you hear something like, "Oh, the Pentagon spent $15 per roll of toilet paper. Oh, they're so efficient." I'm like, that's not an efficiency.
No, that's incredibly inefficient. But
well, no. I'm saying that's not inefficiency in the sense that wasn't by mistake.
Oh, right, exactly. Yeah, that wasn't by mistake. But
hopefully the that ability to get wealthy is what keeps them from wanting to do things that would be to us or any sensible, non-nefarious person more efficient.
Well, see, I guess my worry is that the government will get it on board with the technology, and they will start putting these types of transactions like toilet paper on public ledgers for people to see. But they will have a black budget portion of it because they'll have a private chain, so some of the stuff will be off chain, and it will make it so one of the reasons that they can spend $15 on toilet paper is that you don't see that they spent $15 on toilet paper till years later.
Right.
So that's not made public till a long time later. Whereas if it's on a public ledger, you could see immediately, you spent way too much on toilet paper, you're getting a bad deal or whatever. So now granted, they're doing it on purpose because it's a kickback to the lobbyists and stuff like that. But when they can put a portion of their transactions on a public ledger and people see, oh, it's up and up or whatever, at least the portion that we need to know about, and they'll all believe this.
Right.
They'll be like, oh, well, this is all the stuff that's okay, but all that other stuff that needs to be secret. Just like all the people who trust the FBI and the CIA and all that sort of stuff, they're like, well, they would never lie to us, and you're like, they've been lying to us since their inception. They're all liars. Like they've never proven themselves to be honest ever. But if they can give a degree of honesty on a public ledger that's partially private, then I think that solidifies that trust, which I think is very bad. I think people should not trust them. Right. And people are starting to not trust them. I think that's a very good thing. But now the reason they're not trusting them is the whole situation with Trump, which I don't think is a necessarily good reason to not trust them. You shouldn't trust them because they are liars and they're proven liars all throughout their history. But having some sort of ability to publicize that they are being honest, that has a problem. I think that it's a worry I have.
Hopefully it doesn't change anything that much because we still have that degree of most people are like, well, no, they mean well, they're doing this, and then well, we got to cut some of it out, and hopefully, I see your point though, definitely.
Right.
It could add.
The other thing that I see, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with democracy, the god that fails. I could see this solidifying democracy and belief in democracy because you can put voting on the blockchain and people can do it from home. I don't want people voting.
Right.
Why would I want a bunch of dummies who don't know anything to go and vote on what my rights are? And if they make it easier for people to just do from home, that's not good. If every year they issue everybody a block or a key, and then by voting that adds a block to the chain, then you can see in this ledger who voted for everything, and this supposedly will reduce fraud, which it won't. But this makes it so that they'll be like, well, you don't have to do anything. All you have to do is, sign in on your smartphone to government.org or whatever and put your vote in. And I don't like that at all. And,
I get. Go ahead.
Go for it. Well, I'm saying that I've been reading a lot of stuff that is outside of our circles when it comes to blockchain, and a lot of them point out this as a boon, like something that's good. Mm-hmm. And this is not good to me at all. I don't want any sort of solidification of democracy at all. And a lot of people that are from sort of maybe the Bernie Sanders side of this who are interested in blockchain and see this as something that's going to be very egalitarian. In some ways, depending on what you mean by egalitarian, it will be because you won't have the centralized banking and that sort of stuff. But they see this as pushing democracy forward. This doesn't really have anything to do with Bitcoin in particular. This just has to do with how the technology could be applied, and I think in an inappropriate way.
Sure. You talked about this a little bit earlier, talking about the one to many, and hopefully that creates a economic and technological boom. Yeah. And that's where I think like if more people start voting, I mean, I don't think that's great, but I don't like my goal. I don't think that we get rid of the government by convincing people that government's bad. I think we get rid of the government by having technology that just outstrips the government's ability to make economic decisions like the market can. And so you can have the government doing all this stuff, getting whatever they're doing, but in reality they're just like screaming into a void.
Yeah, and I hope that is the truth, because this is another thing that I have that is sort of along the same lines. This is assuming that the government doesn't go away and is still able to have a lot of control over people. Is fake products like carbon credits. So I read a white paper. I could send it to you. I have to find it again, but where they were talking about using this for carbon credits, and I think there's a Chinese company that is already doing this. And this is a bad product, is selling fake coin, basically fake like altcoins as carbon credits. And then this makes a commodity out of pollution, which I think when it comes, you and I can get into this probably for hours and hours and hours. When it comes to pollution, it's not an issue of what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do as far as number of emissions. It has to do with property rights. So yes. you can't throw trash on my lawn. The same thing goes for carbon. Like if you are emitting carbon and it's not a de minimis like imposition or whatever, like breathing is de minimis, and also everybody's homestead the ability to breathe. But like putting a huge amount of smoke out into the air or whatever, that's not necessarily de minimis. And if the market was allowed to progress in that regard, we would be able to have like carbon forensics and things like that and determine where the carbon that's on my property came from, if I saw it as a problem at all, and sue them for dumping trash on my property.
Yes.
So, but that's sort of another thing. But this is another one where like this is one example of like fake products that I could see happening. I also could see this happening with socialized medicine, is where they start issuing like medical credits, and that you have a certain amount because healthcare is going to have to be rationed if they centralize it. And so they'll just be like, no, everybody gets healthcare. Here's your 10 medical credits. And if you don't have enough medical credits to spend, then you die.
Yeah.
And you can't get more because there's not enough healthcare for that. You just get the 10, and 10 might cover, maybe for a year it covers some sort of catastrophic illness, but for like cancer, no, it's not covered. So I could see that being something that could. Now, granted, all of this, if it's warp speed, none of this is really that big of a deal. The next thing though I wanted to get to that could be a big deal if we do go to warp speed, that I was just thinking about this today while I was at work. And are you familiar with DAOs? So they're distributed autonomous organizations.
Yep.
Okay, so this is like, for the listeners, is sort of like cascading smart contracts. And so what I was thinking about this earlier is that this happens sometimes in development, is that you end up getting, particularly in like machine learning or AI, is you end up getting portions of code that rewrite themselves in weird ways that you didn't expect to do what they're doing. But based on the original criteria you gave them, they've decided that what they're doing now is appropriate to the original instruction. And this is like self-writing code and stuff like that, which I'm not actually that great at. Like I know a little bit about machine learning and I vaguely about AI. But one of the examples that was in one of these books that I read about blockchain technology is that, let's imagine that like you buy, like in the future, very near future, we're going to have self-driving cars, and you have a car that you allow for all the times you don't need the car to be a taxi. And part of the automatic contract that you do with the car is that you say, okay, drive when I don't need you. And when you have a flat tire, go to this dealership, and out of the money that you've made as a taxi, you just pay the people with a flat tire. And when you need gas, you go to, this chain of gas stations, whatever, and you fill up and all that sort of stuff. And when you've made X number of dollars, purchase another one of yourself and program them to do what you're doing. Right? Mm-hmm. And you give it enough leeway to make adjustments to be more efficient when it comes to the taxi cab service, to make more money so that you get more of these cars over time. Now, you get hit by a bus and die, and you didn't have anything built into the contract for that to stop. And so these cars just continue doing their thing automatically. And as they're doing it, the contract changes, because every time they execute the portion to buy a new car and increase efficiency, it's going to do something slightly different than the original intention. And oftentimes when a program is written in a particular way, it'll start doing really strange things. And it may not be things that you want. So this is just kind of a basic example of.
That's kind of funny.
It's sort of a weird thing that I could see happening though. And it wouldn't necessarily be like autonomous vehicles, but it could be different types of technology that you don't expect at all. And it could be things like you have self-executing Airbnb or something like that, and you just have these like swaths of like multiple square miles of Airbnbs, and it ends up being just a weird thing. And based on on human reaction to these contracts executing themselves, that will change the economic calculation. And the next contract that's written after the previous one builds up enough money to execute the next one will put something in a place that may make people change their mind again, and it will kind of further execute to a new area. It'll be very strange. Like it'll be I don't have predictions for specifically how it could work, but you could end up with things like large neighborhoods that have nobody living in them.
Right.
Because it is all owned. It's all owned by somebody, but the person who originally owned it is dead and didn't transfer their key.
Yeah, there would I mean, hopefully, since we're talking about it here, or you're coming up with all this, not me. But hopefully that's something that that people that are developing this stuff have in mind, that they could consider this kind of in the same way, where it's like when you talk to a state as to who's going to build the roads, and you give an answer, and then they start saying, like, what about this? What about this? And we're like, I don't know, but I don't have to know. I'm not the one building it. Although you might be the one building it.
Yeah, I could totally see, though, it being weird things like road construction becomes automated. Mm-hmm. And it becomes automated on a chain that has a series of contracts that execute automatically based off of whatever they were originally set out to do. And you end up with not necessarily inefficient. I mean, it could turn out to be like the most efficient thing ever. And then when people say, who will build the roads, you'll just be like, you know what? I don't know. I never thought about it. Nobody, as far as I know, it automatically executes. And whenever we need a road somewhere, or like that road just showed up one day because the contract executed, the next one hired all of these people to build 5 miles out that direction, and now we have houses out there. It's just how it would just be the way that things progress. You would have. It's not that I'm worried about it. I put it in my worry category because I could see it doing very strange things, but it'll just become part of the world. And so,
right, and you learn from. I mean, you can't expect anything to move forward perfectly.
Right.
So there's probably gonna be hiccups. I mean, you wake up one morning, walk downstairs, and there's a road half built in your living room with a bunch of robots.
Yeah, and you're like, what's going on here?
You're like,
well, and what's cool though about the technology is that probably wouldn't happen because they could confirm who owns what where.
Right.
So, but it would be like you might get an offer in your email to buy your house. And you'd be like, oh, that's interesting. It's from, XYZ Corporation or whatever. And it turns out that the owner of XYZ Corporation died with like $50 in the bank, but now XYZ Corporation has been running autonomously for 50 years, and it's a multi-billion-dollar corporation that is just automatically doing things based on market incentive and what it reads out on the internet.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that is
very interesting.
A big concern in Bitcoin right now is what's it called? Estate planning.
Yeah.
Because I mean, right now, if I got hit by a car tomorrow and died, there are only a few people that would know, like, that I even have like Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Like,
that's where,
and how to access it, or if they,
Well, and I think
very good chance they won't be able to access it. So that's one thing, and this is where you gotta maybe work with a lawyer and have your private keys with them. So
well, and I think that's what's going to end up happening with the smart contracts, is that eventually this is going to get to a point where enough people are using it that they're going to have like a dead man switch contract. And if you don't confirm that you're alive still every 6 months or whatever, the contract automatically executes and all of your keys are transferred to your next of kin.
Yep.
And that's fine, and that's a great way to solve it, I think. It's just an interesting thing I was thinking about at work was like, well, what happens when you get smart contracts operating on a blockchain where they're making money autonomously, and they are spending money autonomously, and they're writing their own new contracts. And this is something that's going to happen now. It could actually end up being really, really good. It could be that in the future we won't be complaining about working a 40-hour week. We'll be complaining that we had to work 30 minutes this week, and the rest of the time, we're going to be living decadent lives next to the pool or whatever, or like working on the things that we're interested in working on, like podcasting or tractor stuff. So
exactly. Well, that's what makes us so exciting, is that we have all these things that are popping up, these opportunities, but there's a lot of problems associated with them.
Sure.
But that's
solved
just an opportunity to solve.
Yeah.
It's not that these are like, it's like when we talk about any other thing with the market replacing the government, it's like people say, oh, well, it's not currently like that. It's like, well, I'm sure someone will figure out a creative solution for it. And that's what's exciting. And I want to, before I forget, when you were talking about smart contracts earlier, and also before I forget, did you listen to the recent bonus episode on the Fadcast where Carr talked to J.W. Weatherman?
I don't know if. Oh yeah, I did. Yeah, and actually, I really enjoyed it because you had him on earlier talking about how to raise kids and stuff.
Yep, and then he kind of talked about how Bitcoin could work with insurance contracts with private defense. But what I wanted to say about the smart contract thing was what you were describing a little bit, or maybe I don't know, half hour earlier. I've basically used a service like that. So it's a decentralized exchange called BISC.
Okay.
And so what it is, you have to you install kind of like the software on your computer. So there's no like centralized exchange. You're all kind of running your own node, and you connect via Tor and all that good stuff. And so people put offers up to buy and sell Bitcoin. And so say I find a guy that he's got an offer and I accept it. And so what it does, it creates a 2 of 3 multi-signature arrangement where we both put up a little bit of collateral for Bitcoin. And I send him money through like Venmo or Zelle or however we arrange it. And so when he confirms that once I send it, I sign my end of it and say, hey, I sent the payment. Once he confirms that he gets the payment, he signs it. You have the 2 signatures and the contract executes and sends a Bitcoin to me. If there's a sort of issue where he's saying that he didn't get payment, but I said he did, then you have BISC has like volunteers, or not really volunteers, but people that are the arbitrators that will go in and look at it and make a determination on who should get the Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean that sounds to me like incredibly scalable too.
Yes.
So that could blow up, and that actually takes care of what we were talking about a lot earlier, is the transaction cap. Is that you could actually do transactions that way, especially with large settlements. Is you wouldn't actually, I guess you would do large settlements on chain. It wouldn't be a big deal. But like when you're doing multiple transactions and stuff like that off chain, that's a good way to do it. Is you can just put up a portion of the collateral or any type of contract like that. Like it could have a lot of different applications. And I think that this is actually going to be a huge. People are always afraid that automation is going to end up unemploying a lot of people, and like I said, there may be a chaotic era or whatever, but a chaotic, what is it? Nature abhors a vacuum is, I think, the term, is that during a chaotic era of things changing, this frees up so many people to do other things. Like contract settlement it could be a waste of time very soon, and those people, I'm sure, are smart and meticulous and maybe very skilled. I don't know, but they should be out of that business, or they should be arbitrators or something like that, maybe in the business, but you don't need that many of them. And
sure. Yeah, it's the creative destruction of the market.
Yeah, exactly. They should be. And the thing is too, like if it all takes off, all my critiques aside, if this takes off and Bitcoin becomes money, and the deflationary pressure that I said was kind of a disadvantage, deflation is actually a huge advantage in a lot of ways. And if you can take care of the transaction cap, which it sounds like in this case it is, and also through the Lightning Network is off chain as well, right?
No, all it is really just a series of smart contracts on chain. It's just so, like, if we open up a channel between each other, we create a transaction, but then we don't actually, we can change how much money is on either side of that transaction. Without sending it to the blockchain.
Okay. So that makes sense.
Once we're ready to say, all right, I want to take my money off, then we can, and then there's a network. So it can like if I want to pay Slappy, but I don't have a channel to him, but I have a channel to you, and you have a channel to Slappy, then you can route that payment, get a small, very, very small transaction fee. For your service, for your using your liquidity. And there's also something called AMP, atomic multipaths. So if you have a bigger payment that you want to do, but you don't have, it might be difficult to have a lot of channels with a lot of liquidity in them. What it does is it just splits up the payment to a bunch of different channels, and then ends up all going back together at the destination of the payment. So you don't have to have like massively huge channels to, like, if you're getting paid $5,000 a month from your job, it might not be very practical to be sending a $5,000 transaction every month, but that can get split up into however many channels you have open, and make it so you don't have to have huge channels. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there.
Yeah, well, so I think that's, and like I said, none of the critiques I had about it are insurmountable. They're just things that are
Sure.
like, well, like let's look at this or whatever. So like if that works and you can do the transactions enough, that deflationary pressure is just going to make everybody so much more wealthy on a whole. Like people who obviously who have Bitcoin now, if Bitcoin ends up becoming the money, they're going to have a huge advantage. But the advantage is going to be so great to everybody that I don't think anybody's going to care.
Right.
It's just that your money's actually going to maintain value and increase in value over time, and you'll be able to retire without a 401k, so there won't be market manipulation in that regard, which is going to make everybody more. It's going to help reduce boom and bust cycles. It may not eliminate them, but if people can get off fiat and get off an inflationary system, then a lot of decisions that people make will be different. And like I really think that the government has actually Mary Ruirt talks about something very similar to this in her most recent book. I can't remember what it's called, but it's about the medical industry and how basically like if you aggregate the average life expectancy of people and what government regulation has done in the health industry, like they basically robbed everybody of about 10 years of their life. Just because of the way that they bog down medical technology, and then also just like technology that exists that you're not allowed to use because of whatever reason. But the same thing happens though in just earning money and increasing your wealth, is that the government has caused inflation so much and they've deteriorated your earning potential and increased your cost of living so much that they're stealing hours of your week. I don't think people should be working 40 hours a week. I don't think that they need to. I think that in reality, if money was free and hard, we'd be working. I actually get a lot done in about 10 hours a week. And actually in order for me to break even for my company, I only have to bill for, I think, 4.5 hours. But I'm there for 40 hours and I bill for quite a bit more than that. And that is kind of, I think, one of the things that hopefully cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, if we're right, because I also hold Bitcoin, I think that'll probably end up being the money. If we're correct and that becomes money, I think that's going to be the biggest change, is that the money and the technology increase is going to be such a deflationary event, and our money is going to be all worth so much more, and therefore we're just not going to have to work nearly as much as we used to, and it's going to be continuously deflating. So it'll stabilize at some point, and it won't be like runaway deflation where like people can't make money by manufacturing things, like, which is what a lot of people are worried about. But it'll appreciate over time the way it should, so that you can hold Bitcoin as you're getting older, put it into a smart contract that pays you a dividend, and get it back when you're 45 or whatever and retire.
Yeah, no, I think I completely agree. And I was listening to Stefan Livera's podcast. It's a Bitcoin podcast. He had Gene Epstein on, and they were talking.
I think you sent that one to me actually, or maybe the name sounds familiar.
I probably sent you one of his podcasts before. This is a pretty recent episode, but they were talking about this kind of situation where, it's like, well, what happens if we have, because of deflation, money appreciating, that, you can't pay your employer or your employee as much as you did last year. But it's like, you really think people are going to complain when they get a 10%, nominal pay cut, but the cost of everything is dropped by 30%?
Yeah.
Or maybe they don't take a pay cut, but they just work less hours. I mean, the opportunity there is
well, and this is also going to be, we're going to be in a very different economy as well. So right now we have this concept that you're going to work for an employer, whereas I think that people talk about the sharing economy with like Uber and Lyft and all that sort of stuff. That's not really the sharing economy. That's more of like a central authority coordinating unused goods, basically. So like it's not exactly sharing. So in the future, I don't necessarily think that the employer-employee relationship is going to be that common. I think people will contract their time. They'll have a specialty that'll be able to be verified on the blockchain, and so you don't have to have a degree or anything that says that you are a doctor or whatever. People will be able to verify it. because they'll be able to see that throughout your life you did this number of things. It's verifiable, it's public, everybody can see that you're an expert in medical whatever. And instead of working at the hospital, well, I mean, there will still probably be a physical hospital, but instead of working for the hospital, you have a certain amount of time that's available. Automatic contracts will negotiate that time, and you'll have to be at certain places based on your contractual obligations, and you'll work for yourself, but it'll be automated.
Mm-hmm. And that's really that's Bitcoin is making money like its most truest thing.
Yeah.
In that it is showing who is providing society the most value.
Exactly. And so if this year the doctor, he made 1 Bitcoin this year for, whatever, and then next year he makes half a Bitcoin, well, who cares? That's what the contracts came in that he was able to do, and that clearly is the market signaling that his services were not as in demand. The money is going to the appropriate place, and also because of the deflationary pressures, he probably doesn't take any sort of cut in his lifestyle. And everybody's lifestyle is going to be so much better that nobody's going to care anyways. So
right.
And there's a lot of arguments that people have right now that I think this technology is going to totally get rid of completely. Like borders will not be an argument anymore.
Yep.
Democrats and Republicans fighting over control of the government's going to be irrelevant because the government's going to be irrelevant.
Yeah.
So if it happens the way that my optimistic mind thinks, if my pessimistic mind thinks about it in different ways, that they'll figure out a way to destroy it and ruin it. But I think that we are kind of at that singularity point where this particular technology is changing the world as much as like the steam engine. It's like things are different now. And with the advent of the steam engine, you had this like increase of technology exponentially, and eventually you had not that much longer after. I think the steam engine was invented in the mid 1700s, and then like 150 years later you have airplanes.
Right. Yeah.
Like it's fast, and the way that technology is going now, it's so much faster. And if you can kind of get rid of the barriers the government puts up, we're going to be living completely different lifestyles. You and I are going to listen back to this podcast and we're going to go, that was really silly, all those things that we brought up, because all of the stuff that we predicted, none of that actually happened. We actually got off centralized banking and society just changed. Like maybe I won't even be afraid of like the Bernie Sanders types anymore, because there'll be so much plenty that, I mean, I'm sure people will still be envious because that's just people, but there'll be so much plenty that they just won't care enough to do anything about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a lot of the Bitcoiners talk about it gradually but suddenly. Like right now, while we're still waiting there, it's feeling like it's going to take forever. Although the reality is, like, just seeing where Bitcoin has gone in the last 10 years, it's
it's crazy. Well, I mean, even from when I heard about it till now, how different it is.
Yeah.
I mean, like I got an app on my smartphone that I didn't have when I first heard about Bitcoin. I had a flip phone still, but I have an app on my phone now that I can transact in Bitcoin. It's not even like I don't use it, but it's entered the modern consciousness enough that Cash App has it as part of the app, and other apps do too. So it's like and you can accept payments very easily now through it, which still I'm not accepting any crypto payments on Childerberg, which I gotta eventually sit down and actually like set that all up so people can buy stuff in the store in crypto. But there's been very little demand for it. I think there's been like 3 or 4 people who are like, hey, can I pay in crypto? And then I just let them pay on the Cash App. Okay. But yeah, like there's like the world's changing fast. Like just to think about 10 years ago how different our lives were.
Yeah.
Like there's like 3 podcasts. There were 3 podcasts or something like that 10 years ago.
Well, I mean, just look at YouTube. Is YouTube even? Yeah,
YouTube is 2006 or 2007.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm somewhere around there, maybe 2008. And so, I mean, smartphones were what, 2008?
Yeah, I think they announced the iPhone 2007.
Yeah,
and it didn't come out until 2008, or maybe late 2007, like for Christmas or something.
Wi-Fi, high-speed internet.
Yeah.
I remember when we didn't have cable when I was growing up.
Yeah. I remember
remote control on the TV in the living.
Oh yeah. Well, I remember. So I don't know how much older I am than you. I'm 32, and
I'm 31.
Okay, so yeah, we're roughly the same age. I remember getting a DVD player in 1998.
Wow.
It was on the computer, and people from the neighborhood came over to watch DVDs on our computer. It was like thinking back on it, I'm like, that's bizarre. But
Yeah.
but also thinking back on it, I mean, this was like a fascinating technology, and now DVD, like I threw all my DVDs away when we moved because they're obsolete.
I probably own a few DVDs, but never use them. I mean, this computer I'm using now has a DVD drive, but I've probably used it once, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I mean, just look at how quickly streaming services popped up that you don't even need, like, just wherever you are, you just watch whatever you want.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, for better or for worse, and the compression is getting much better. Like the bandwidth that they use is not nearly as high as it used to be. And then just the amount of bandwidth available. I'm very excited about decentralized internet in general. So once it doesn't rely so much on centralized servers and things like that, where like in the United States, I think I don't remember the exact number, but there's like certain number of points where everything has to route through.
Okay.
Which is not great because, I mean, theoretically, if the government really wanted to, like this happened actually on the East Coast a couple of years ago, where one of those routing point, I can't remember what they're called because I'm not a network specialist, so I don't really know exactly. But I remember a couple of years ago, one of them went out, and it took like 3 days for all the traffic to be rerouted to the other ports, I guess. I don't know what they're called exactly. Somebody
Right.
who's listening will be able to correct me on this, but I remember there was like a 3-day period when like regular high-speed internet wasn't available. And it was because it had to route around. But there's a lot of technology being developed in places where and there actually used to be something very similar to this that I think is illegal now for some reason, but it used to be you could actually contract with AT&T to put up a cell internet router basically in your attic. And the only reason I know about this is that a friend of mine got one and was harvesting people's data. And he like there wasn't a lot of like useful information on it. He was just curious like what was going through there. And so he was like, look at this person, like he's like all this stuff is going on. And I got his GPS location from all of these different places. It was kind of creepy, but this was like in 2008 or 2009. And AT&T would let you put these up. This is like right around when iPhones were becoming popular, and so they were like, we quickly need to get internet everywhere.
I think you can. I might have been on a Bitcoin podcast I was listening to, but I think you can like be your own ISP.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I don't know much about it, but it's not. I don't think it's that difficult. I mean,
I know that it used to be that there was a lot of people who ran very small ISPs, but a lot of them got shut down because of FDA regulation or FCC regulations.
Okay.
Like that a lot of that came through. You might be able to still do it by yourself. I remember talking to a guy about it where he was saying like all these regulations came in from the FCC in the late 90s, and it made it so difficult to run. He ran a small ISP in his hometown, and so he was basically the only internet provider in this podunk town in Virginia, and some regulations came through, and he's like, I just couldn't afford the regulation costs anymore.
Yeah, and it might be a thing where you're not allowed to be a commercial ISP, but
that could be, yeah. But there, anyways, kind of what I was talking about with the AT&T thing is this: they've been developing this for years. There's these alternative networks that show up that are basically what we're talking about with the Lightning Network is it's a physical version of that where you run your own and you make these connections, and people can hook up to the internet through you, and you can hook up to all these other connections. And as long as you have a chain all the way to an entry point into the regular internet, then you can get online.
Okay. Is that like
they were doing it in the Middle East for a while.
GoTenna does something like that.
It could be that. So what's cool about the one that they were doing in the Middle East, this was like back kind of during the Arab Spring time, is they were starting to develop these out there because those governments kept kill switching the internet. So they started developing internal sites and stuff like that would operate on these.
Oh, like the mesh networks?
Yeah. So they're mesh networks. Yeah, they're mesh networks, but what they were doing is they were operating like not internet-facing sites to be able to coordinate information and get information out of those countries where they had shut the internet down. So they would operate these mesh networks, so you could go on and see where a protest was going to happen, and they would have these. And it was like old internet, like where you.
Oh, gotcha.
It was very bizarre. to see like people operating on this, because you would have to go to these boards, and the boards would have all the links on them. They didn't really have any search engines that were running on it and stuff, but there were sites internal to the mesh network that you could do this. So I can see that type of thing scaling up, and us getting away from the situation where you have to go through these central locations and the government has the ability to just kill it.
Yeah, I mean, well, Bitcoin's actually driving a lot of that technology because they're trying to figure out ways. Well, one to keep the data that they're sending back and forth very, very small, so they don't have to put a lot of stress on whatever they're doing. But between like GoTenna type stuff, with all the mesh networks,
I think that is one of them. GoTenna is, I think, one. But yeah, those mesh network type things, and you know, you can only know about so much stuff, and I don't really know that much about network side of things. Like I'm a software developer, and I'm in a very specific portion of software development. So I do a lot of financial stuff. So I could talk to you about taxes and commissions calculation and payroll calculation and things like that. But like a lot of the other stuff, I don't know a huge amount about, and I'm learning more about machine learning and now crypto technology, which I think is fascinating. But so there's so much to know, but I feel like this new paradigm is kind of bringing people together to push toward something new.
Right.
And we'll see what that is.
Yeah, it's drinking from a fire hose a little bit, but it's awesome that it's all happening. I mean, what an exciting time to be alive.
Oh, it is, definitely. All right, I think that is all of my notes.
Yeah. This was I'm glad we did this. I was looking forward to this for a while. I think it's a great talk. Anyone have any thoughts or anything, feel free to get in touch with any of us. Before you shout out anything, do you have a free market success story?
A free market? Oh, actually I do.
Okay, so I
prepared it for the show specifically. When Mel mentioned it, or I doxed her just now. When
that's all right,
Empress of Memes, when Empress of Memes mentioned it, I was like, oh, I'll prepare one too. But nice. You can go with yours, and I'll go with mine, I guess.
Okay, so I have a new job in the last couple weeks, and the water jug thing just tastes awful. I don't know what it is. It's like, I think it's Nestle. I think I saw it, but one of those, what do they call them? Just the water cooler. It's just nasty.
Yeah,
I don't like it. And so what I did was I found a little Brita water bottle filter. It's just got the little carbon filter in there, and I bought one, brought it in. So now I just fill that bottle up with water and then squeeze it into my normal drinking mug, and it tastes fine. So
that's pretty cool.
For just a couple bucks, it solved my problem for me.
I used to do a lot of long distance bicycle riding, and I had something similar to that where you could just fill it up with lake or river water, and then and then squeeze it through, and then it would purify it so that you could get most of the stuff that would kill you out of it. Those are really neat. They're really cool.
Yeah. It's just a little simple. I think it's just a carbon block basically, right?
Yeah. A lot of them have multi-filter systems and stuff. Some of them are just a carbon filter. But yeah, there's all sorts of weird stuff that people put in water, and it just tastes weird. I don't know. Yeah,
I have no idea, because you would think that like a water cooler water, they would make it taste like nothing. And I wasn't actually really because this had a really strong taste, and I wasn't convinced that it was going to work. But
yeah, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, well, I mean that's a success though.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's hear yours.
So mine is free market success story. There is a company called Last Bottle Wines that I buy a lot of my wine from, and a feature that they have that I think is really cool is that during the summertime they'll allow you to hold your purchases until it's cooler, so that you don't have to pay for cooled shipping. And recently they do these marathons every once in a while where they'll just every 5 minutes or every 15 minutes they'll switch the wine that's available until it's sold out. And so I bought a ton of stuff from them during that thing. And usually they'll ship it about 2 weeks after the marathon. Well, they contacted me and said, hey, we were looking at the weather in Texas, and we saw that it was still 105 every day. Do you want us to ship this to you, or do you want us to hold this with your other stuff and just ship it to you in the fall? And I said, well, I don't want to be shipped when it's 105, it's going to be hotter in the truck and it's going to damage the wine. So,
Right.
so I said, no, hold it until the other stuff's done. I'd like it to be like under 75 before you ship it, if you could. And they were like, oh yeah, no problem. So it still hasn't arrived yet because it's still really hot in Texas. We had our first like cool couple of days, the last 4 days or 5 days. So I should be getting it soon. But it's pretty cool that they like reached out and were like, let's accommodate you. I think that's a market success story. Like they know. It's actually a really cool company too. Like the idea of it, I think it's sort of like an auction, but more like it's a fixed price, but they don't have very much of it. So it's just, they sell it until it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
So just the internet is awesome in providing cool things like that.
Yeah, that is really neat. I always love stories where you have a company that like goes out of their way to.
Yeah, they've got to have thousands of customers. I can't believe they called and we're like, do you want us to hold this? But people care about their wine, so I'm sure they by getting ahead of that, they also save themselves a lot of labor and complaints and people trying to return stuff.
Well, it made, and this is why I love doing the free market success story, because when a company does something that's really good, and we talk about it and let other people know, we send signals out for them, we do marketing for them. Yeah. I mean, it's not only are they helping you, but they're also helping themselves, because they probably figured that you're going to go around saying like, wow, look at this great thing that they just did. And it's going to make you want to be their customer more and recommend them. So,
well, and we already recommend them. We have like an affiliate thing with them. So
do you have an affiliate? Do you have the code or anything for people that want to?
Yeah, if people want to go and save $10 on their first purchase, they can go over to tastinganarchy.com and the link is right there in the center of the page. So awesome. It's Last Bottle Wines. They have a new wine every day unless they're doing a marathon, and once the wine is gone, it's gone.
Great. So I mean, good time to tastinganarchy.com. You've got an excellent podcast about wine and how much government's in it. So why don't you tell people a little bit about that who don't know?
Well, I mean, that was a great summary for it. It's Tasting Anarchy. You can also follow us at Tasting Anarchy on Twitter. We actually have a Facebook now that neither one of us are super active on, but basically everything I put on our Instagram, which is also Tasting Anarchy, will repost there, and the episodes repost to Facebook automatically as well. Basically you summarized it. It's we are taking a look at the wine mostly that Mason and I like. We're also exploring new wines together because he and I are good friends. We've been in the Liberty Movement together for 10 plus years now, and decided to start the show. We're coming up on our 2-year anniversary, and it's really fascinating to see how much the government is involved in something really basic like wine. It's huge. There's a huge, and internationally there's all sorts of different things too. So it's really fascinating to see this. It's kind of a position that a lot, even anarchists, don't really think about that much when it comes to the government. It's sometimes, and then there's things that are just like so far separated from it, and you're like, how is this doubling the price of my bottle of wine when it's like something like 20 steps removed, and you're like, well, they did this regulation, and that plays into this, and this, and that's why now your wine costs twice as much. So that's it.
Awesome. Awesome. So that'll be on the show notes page, how to find Jacob and Tasting Anarchy at mcflugel.com/166. Also, we'll link to Childerberg.com. That's
so Childerberg, it's May 23rd through 26th at Emma Long Metropolitan Park in Austin, Texas. It's Mason keeps saying bookending the LNC, but I don't know if it's bookending it because it's not on both sides. It's only on one side of it, but it's simultaneous. And then one day after it, it's just a great, Liberty get together, meet your friends that you know from online in real life. There's going to be a ton of podcasters. There'll be some live music and some live comedy and just a lot of cool people.
And fruitcake.
Yeah. And we had we had an awesome fruitcake last time. And all the proceeds from any additional money over the cost that we raise will go to freeross.org, who we mentioned earlier. Yep. I think we raised, we paid in Bitcoin, but I think it was like at the time the equivalent of like $350 or something like that.
Yeah.
So pretty fruitful when it was like that's about $10 per person that attended the first time. So
yeah,
it was nice.
It was an awesome event. I absolutely loved it, and we'll definitely not be missing it in the future.
Cool.
So yeah, you can hang on for a second after we sign off, but or I stop the recording. But yeah, thanks for coming on. This was everything that I wanted for this conversation and more. I had a blast. So
awesome. Yeah, great.
All right, thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you next week.
All right, thank you. Bye.